Wyoming Territory. September 1874. She stepped off the stagecoach, silk dress destroyed, hair half gone, eyes raw from days of crying, and looked straight at the man waiting for her. Then she burst into tears. Not quietly, not prettily, the kind that came from somewhere well past pride. The man stood still for a moment, then walked over. "Miss LeClaire," he said. Low, unhurried. She looked up, eyes swollen but sharp. "Still watching, still thinking, Mr. Vance." He picked up her valise. "Buckboard's this way." She didn't know yet that this man would stand between her and a grizzly bear, would set her shoulder in a blizzard cave, would hand her a deed with both their names on it, and call her his partner, like it was simply the next true thing to say. It all starts here. Keep reading. The stagecoach came in late. It always did. The driver, a leathery old man named Hooker, who smelled of tobacco and regret, had a habit of stopping too long at every relay station between Cheyenne and Willow Creek. He claimed it was for the horses. Everyone knew it was for the whiskey. By the time the coach rattled into the depot, the afternoon sun had already begun its slow bleed across the Wyoming sky, painting everything in shades of amber and rust. September out here didn't ease you into the cold. It ambushed you. One moment the air was warm enough to fool you, and the next, a wind off the Wind River Range cut straight through your coat, like it had a personal grievance. Ezra Vance stood at the edge of the depot platform and watched the coach slow to a stop. He had his hands in his coat pockets. His Stetson was pulled low, not against the sun. The sun was already going, but out of habit. 11 years of habit, to be exact. Ever since he'd come home from the war and discovered that keeping the brim down meant people couldn't read your face as easily. Out on the frontier, a readable face was a liability. He was a tall man, not imposing in the theatrical way that some men tried to be, but tall in the way that mountains were tall simply, unavoidably, matter-of-factly. His leather coat was the color of dark tobacco, worn at the elbows, and had seen enough weather to qualify as a geological record. His jaw was rough with 3 days of stubble. His eyes, beneath the Stetson's shadow, were a pale, watchful gray. He'd placed the advertisement 6 weeks ago, a single column in the Philadelphia Inquirer and 2 smaller papers in New Orleans. He'd written it himself, which had taken him 4 drafts and an embarrassing amount of crumpled paper. Wanted, capable woman of good character, experienced in household management and bookkeeping, to serve as household manager on working cattle ranch in Wyoming Territory. Honest work, fair wages, separate quarters provided, no nonsense. Reply to E. Vance, Broken Elbow Ranch, Willow Creek, Wyoming. He'd received 9 letters. 8 of them were from women who sounded desperate in ways that suggested they were hiding something difficult. The 9th was from a woman in Philadelphia named Corinne LeClaire. Her letter was composed in a clean, slanted hand, precise, almost architectural in its construction. She wrote that she had experience managing a large household, keeping accounts, and corresponding on behalf of a prominent family. She wrote that she was 23 years old, in good health, and that she found herself in need of a change of circumstances. She wrote that she was not afraid of hard work, though she acknowledged the frontier would be an adjustment. She did not whine. She did not plead. She stated facts the way a ledger stated numbers plainly, leaving no room for confusion. He'd written back the same week. Now the coach door swung open, and the first person out was a traveling salesman with a sample case and a red face. Then a minister who looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days. Then a heavy-set woman with 3 hat boxes, who immediately began arguing with Hooker about the condition of her luggage. Then Corinne LeClaire stepped out of the stagecoach. Ezra's first thought was that the journey had nearly destroyed her. Her traveling gown had once been something, silk, by the look of it, in a shade of deep blue-green that would have been elegant under gas lamps in a Philadelphia parlor. Out here, in the dust and the wind and the fading light of a Wyoming September, It looked like a shipwreck. The hem was destroyed. There was a tear along one sleeve. The bodice was creased in ways that suggested she'd slept in it for several nights running, which she probably had. Her hair, dark brown and thick, had been pinned up at some point in the journey. Now it was more suggestion than structure. A loose, wind-blown arrangement that had given up pretending somewhere around the Nebraska border. She was holding a small valise, leather, good quality, though it had taken its share of abuse. She held it against her chest like it was the only solid thing in a tilting world. Her eyes were red. Not pink around the edges red. Not the delicate storybook kind of crying, the kind of red that came from weeping hard and long and repeatedly over a period of days. The kind that left a person hollow and fragile and scraped clean of everything except the bare will to keep standing. She stepped off the coach stairs and her feet hit the depot platform, and she looked up. She saw the mountains first. Everyone did. The Wind River Range rose in the north and west like something out of a fever dream, brutal, enormous, indifferent. Up close to the range, where the sky met the peaks, there was already snow. In September, the light was failing fast, and the shadows the mountains threw were vast and cold. Then she looked at the depot, at the dust, at the rough-hewn buildings of Willow Creek beyond the platform, their false fronts and peeling paint and hitching posts. Then she looked at Ezra. He hadn't moved. He was just standing there, watching her the way he watched everything steadily, without urgency, without expression. She burst into tears. Not quietly, not prettily, the kind of tears that came from a place well past pride. Her face crumpled, her shoulders came forward, and she pressed the back of one gloved hand to her mouth as if she could hold it back, and she couldn't, and she didn't. Ezra stood still for a moment. He was not a man who reacted quickly to displays of emotion, mostly because he'd learned, over a long and difficult life, that reacting quickly was usually wrong. He let her cry for a few seconds. He watched the traveling salesman edge away from her. He watched Hooker very studiously examine something on the undercarriage of Coach. Then Ezra walked over to her. He stopped about 3 feet away. He reached up and touched the brim of his Stetson in a gesture that was as close as he usually got to formal greeting. "Miss LeClaire," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud because it was used to being listened to. She looked up at him. Her eyes were dark, a deep, almost black-brown, and even swollen from crying they were sharp, intelligent. He noticed that through the tears, the mind behind them was still working. "Mr. Vance," she managed. Her voice was steadier than he expected, a slight remnant of a French lilt in the vowels, polished almost to invisibility by years in Philadelphia. Almost. He picked up her valise. She almost protested. He could see it start in her expression, then apparently decided she didn't have the energy. "Buckboard's this way," he said, and started walking. She followed. The ride out to the ranch was 7 miles of rutted track, through sagebrush flats and dry creek beds with the mountains growing larger and more serious in the distance. The buckboard was not a comfortable vehicle. It was built for hauling fence posts and grain sacks, not for passengers, and it communicated every rock in the road directly to your spine. Corinne sat on the bench beside him and said nothing for the first 2 miles. Ezra did not fill silences. He'd never seen the point. The country was doing plenty of talking on its own. The creak of the axles, the dry wind through the sage, the distant sound of the river somewhere to the north. A man who talked over all that was just making noise. She was composing herself. He could feel it happening beside him, the way you felt a change in the weather before it arrived. The tears had stopped. She was sitting straighter. She was looking at the landscape with an expression that had shifted from devastated to something more complicated, something that acknowledged how alien this all was, while also refusing to entirely collapse under that alienness. He gave her credit for that. It was around the 3rd mile that she cleared her throat. "Mr. Vance," she said, "I need to tell you something, all right." She looked straight ahead. Her hands were folded in her lap over the valise. I was not entirely truthful in my letters. He kept his eyes on the track ahead. How so? She breathed in. I said I had experience managing a household. You did. I managed the household, she said. I did not manage it the way your advertisement described. I did not cook. I did not clean. I did not do laundry or mend clothing or preserve food or any of the practical work you will need done. I directed the servants who did those things. I kept the accounts. I wrote correspondence. A pause. I have never in my life lit a cook fire. Ezra let that sit for a moment. All right, he said again. She glanced at him sideways, clearly expecting more. Is that all? He said. Another breath. No. She straightened her spine another degree as if bracing herself. I am not simply a woman looking for employment and a change of scenery. I am fleeing a situation in Philadelphia. A man, a very powerful, very unpleasant man, to whom my family arranged for me to be married. I did not consent to the arrangement. I did not have the option to refuse it by their accounting. Her voice stayed level through all of this with some effort. When I answered your advertisement, I was looking for a way out, a way far enough out that he could not easily follow. The buckboard hit a rock and lurched. Ezra handled it without looking down. Is this man likely to come looking? He said. Eventually, perhaps. He is more concerned with the insult to his pride than with me, specifically, I think. But yes, eventually, all right, Ezra said. She stared at him. That is all you have to say? What would you like me to say? I have deceived you about my qualifications, and I've told you I may be bringing trouble to your doorstep. You could reasonably be furious with me. Ezra was quiet for a moment, watching the track wind through a stand of scrubby cottonwoods near a dry wash. The light was going fast now. In another hour, it would be fully dark, and the temperature would drop 10 degrees. You told me the truth just now, he said. Before we got to the ranch, you could have waited. Could have let me find out later, when it'd be harder for me to do anything about it. You didn't. He glanced at her for the first time. That counts for something. She seemed to not quite know what to do with that. They rode another quarter-mile in silence. Then he heard a sound beside him, a small, hitched breath. He looked over. She was bent forward over the valise. Her shoulders were drawn in. Her hands had gone to the hem of his coat. Not her coat, his coat, which was laid across the bench between them for warmth, and for a disoriented second he couldn't tell what she was doing. Then he understood. She had his boot in her hands. His right boot, the one closest to her. She had her fingers around the heel and was pulling. He pulled the reins. Whoa! The horses stopped. He sat very still for a moment, looking at her. She hadn't looked up. She was focused on the boot with a kind of practiced, automatic concentration. The concentration of someone performing a task so ingrained it had moved below the level of thought. Miss LeClaire. She looked up, and he saw, in that single instant, before she understood what she was doing, that she hadn't been present. She'd been somewhere else entirely, back in some room in Philadelphia, performing a duty that someone had apparently required of her, often enough that her hands did it, without asking permission from her mind. Then she understood. Her face went through several things in rapid succession. Recognition, horror, mortification so complete it was nearly physical. She dropped his boot like it had burned her. She sat back hard against the bench. She started. Here. Ezra stepped down from the buckboard. He walked around to the ground in front of the bench, in his socked feet, crouched down, and gripped the heel of his own boot. He pulled it back on. Then he reached behind the bench and found the pair of sturdy lace-up work shoes he'd bought in Willow Creek 2 weeks ago, after he'd sent his acceptance letter and had done his best to estimate a woman's shoe size from her letters. He held them up. She stared at them. He looked up at her, crouched there in the dirt, in front of the buckboard. There are no masters or servants under my roof, Miss LeClaire, he said. Out here, you stand on your own 2 feet, and you command your own life. The words came out plain and straightforward, the way all his words did. Not as a speech, not performed. He meant it the way he meant everything, simply, directly, as a statement of fact. She looked down at him. In the last light, she looked very young and very tired and very far from everything she had ever known. He held out the shoes. After a moment, she took them. She looked at them in her hands, solid leather, sensible heel, meant for real ground and real work. And something in her expression shifted. Not joy, not relief exactly. Something quieter than both of those. Something that looked like the first faint, cautious recognition that a person might, eventually, be safe. She reached down and worked off her ruined traveling shoes, expensive things that had not been built for anything more demanding than a parlor floor, and set them aside. She put on the work shoes herself. Her hands were steady. "Thank you," she said. Ezra got back up on the buckboard. They fit. She flexed her feet experimentally. "Well enough." "Good." He picked up the reins. "Ranch is about 4 miles yet. There'll be supper." He clicked his tongue, and the horses started forward again. She sat beside him in the growing dark, wearing borrowed shoes on a buckboard in Wyoming, and she did not cry again. Not that night. The Broken Elbow Ranch came into view around the bend in the creek at full dark, and it was exactly what the name suggested. Not romantic, not quaint. It was a working ranch built by a man who cared about function and had limited patience for anything else. The main cabin was log construction, solid and square, with a covered porch running the length of the front and a stone chimney already breathing a thin line of smoke into the black sky. There was a barn, newer than the cabin, and a series of corrals beyond it. A bunkhouse sat off to the left. Lantern light leaked around the shutters of the cabin windows. A dog came out of the dark to meet them, a large, rough-coated thing, brown and white, who approached the buckboard with enormous dignity and then pressed its heavy head against Ezra's knee when he climbed down. "That's Sergeant," Ezra said. "He won't bother you." Corinne climbed down carefully from the buckboard on her own. She looked at the dog. The dog looked at her. She held out her hand, and the dog sniffed it once, and then apparently issued a favorable ruling and wandered back to the porch. Ezra brought the horses around to the barn. Corinne carried her own valise up the porch steps and waited. She did not go inside without being invited. He noticed that. When he came back from the barn, he held the door open. "Come in inside." The cabin was warm from the fire. It was spare. Clean in the way a solitary man's space is clean functional, undecorated, every object present because it had a purpose. A table with 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, a cook stove, a bookshelf with perhaps 30 volumes standing in a straight-backed row, a rifle over the door, buffalo hide on the floor in front of the fire. There was a second door at the back of the cabin. "Your quarters are through there," Ezra said. "Small room. There's a proper bed, a trunk, a washstand. It's not what you're used to." "It's fine," she said. She said it without hesitation, which he appreciated. "Supper's in the larder. Salt pork and dried beans need cooking. There's cornbread from this morning." He paused. "You said you've never lit a cook fire." I said, "I've never lit one." "I did not say I don't know what one is." "Fair distinction." He moved toward the cook stove. "Watch, then. Tomorrow you try." She watched him work, and she did so carefully, with the focused attention of someone who was not too proud to learn. He showed her how the stove's damper worked, how to coax the fire up without smothering it, how to judge the heat. She asked 2 questions. Both were good questions, specific, practical, the questions of someone who was already thinking about doing it herself, rather than just watching. He set the beans to cook and cut the cornbread. They ate at the table across from each other in the lamplight, and it was quiet, but not uncomfortably so. Outside, the wind had picked up. The fire snapped. At one point, he noticed her looking at the bookshelf. "You read," he said. "Extensively," she said. It was one of the few things I was permitted to do without supervision. He didn't say anything to that. She caught something in his expression. "You have Montaigne," she said, nodding toward the shelf. He glanced at it. "Got it in Virginia. Long story. Do you read French?" "Some. Enough to argue with it." He looked looked back at her. You? My father's first language. A brief something crossed her face. Not quite grief, not quite fondness, but something that lived in the neighborhood of both. He read to me in French when I was small. Ezra nodded. He didn't pry. A person's grief was their own business unless they chose to make it otherwise. After supper, he showed her around the rest of the cabin, where things were kept. The root cellar access behind the stove, the water barrel on the porch, the lamp oil, the rifle which was always loaded and which he would show her how to fire if she was willing. She was willing. She said it without drama. At the door to her room, she stopped and turned back. "Mr. Vance," she said. "Ma'am." She looked at him for a moment with those sharp, tired, dark eyes. Why? Why take a chance on a complete stranger? One who has just told you she lied in her correspondence and may be bringing trouble behind her. He thought about that honestly for a moment. He wasn't a man who gave dishonest answers to real questions. "This valley is hard," he said. "Running a ranch alone is harder. I need someone who can think and who can work and who won't quit when it gets difficult." He paused. "Your letter told me you could think. Tonight told me you won't quit." He reached up and pulled the door open for her. "We'll find out about the rest." She stood there a moment longer. Then quietly, "I won't," she said. "Quit, I know," he said. He pulled the door to and left her to her first night in Wyoming, while outside the wind moved down from the mountains and the cottonwoods along the creek, bent and rustled in the dark, and the stars over the Wind River Valley burned cold and impossibly close. Sergeant came in through the doggy hole in the cabin wall and settled himself in front of the fire with a heavy, satisfied grunt. Ezra sat down in the chair by the fire with the Montaigne. He opened it. He didn't read it for a while. He just sat with it in his hands and listened to the wind and thought about what the morning would look like. In the spare room, on the other side of the wall, there was silence for a long time. Then, very quietly, a sound he almost missed. A single breath let out slowly, deliberately, like a woman setting down something heavy she'd been carrying a very long way. He turned to the first page and began to read. The morning came in hard and cold. Corinne heard the ranch before she saw it. Through the thin wall of her room, the sounds arrived in sequence. The low complaint of cattle somewhere distant, the rhythmic strike of an axe splitting wood, boots crossing the porch boards, the creak of the well handle. All of it underscored by wind. There was always wind. It pushed against the cabin walls like it was testing them, like it wanted to know if they were serious about staying. She lay still for a moment in the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling. The room was small. She'd known that last night, but in the morning light coming through the single window, it was more clearly, honestly small. A bed with a rope frame and a corn husk mattress that had surprised her by being more comfortable than expected. A trunk at the foot of it, empty. A wooden washstand with a ceramic basin and a pitcher of water that had gone cold overnight. A single peg on the wall where she'd hung what remained of her traveling ensemble. A braided rug on the floor in a pattern of browns and dull reds. That was it. That was the whole room. She had grown up in a house with 14 rooms. She'd had a personal maid, a dressing room, a writing desk positioned to catch morning light, curtains that cost more than a working man's monthly wages. She'd had opinions about curtains. She sat up, put her feet on the braided rug, breathed. You chose this, she told herself. That was the relevant fact. Not what she'd left behind, not what she'd traded away, what she'd chosen. And people who chose things did not lie in bed cataloging their losses. They got up. She got up. She dressed in the most practical things she'd brought. A dark wool skirt and a plain white shirtwaist. Both purchased quietly during the weeks she'd been planning her escape from Philadelphia, and both chosen for durability over appearance. She pinned her hair up efficiently. She washed her face with the cold water. Then she went out into the cabin. Ezra was not inside. The fire in the cook stove was already going. She could feel the warmth from across the room, and there was a tin coffee pot on the burner. The smell of it filled the whole cabin. She stood near the stove and held her hands close to the warmth and looked at the cook stove the way she sometimes looked at problems that needed solving. Last night, he'd shown her the damper, the draft, how to read whether the fire was hot enough by how the stove's surface felt when you held your hand above it. She'd paid attention. She had always paid attention to things, even to things she wasn't supposed to care about. It had been, in her previous life, frequently inconvenient. She found the larder. It was deep, a cabinet along the north wall, cool even with the stove going, stocked with the kind of supplies a solitary man accumulated when he bought things by necessity rather than preference. Dried beans, salt pork, hardtack, a crock of lard, a sack of cornmeal, some dried apples going slightly leathery at the edges, a half-round of cheese under a cloth. She found the cast-iron skillet on its hook beside the stove. She found the eggs, a small basket of them on the larder shelf, still cold. She could do eggs. She was nearly certain she could do eggs. She set the skillet on the stove and found the lard and thought about what she'd watched the cook do. The Philadelphia kitchen she'd never been supposed to enter. On the mornings, she slipped in anyway because the kitchen was warm and nobody there expected anything formal from her. She put lard in the skillet. She cracked the first egg on the edge of the pan. The shell went into the skillet along with the egg. She fished the shell out, most of it. She cracked the second egg more carefully. The third she did almost correctly. By the fourth, she had a system, though it still wasn't elegant. She was absorbed enough in this operation that she didn't hear the cabin door open behind her. Morning. She turned. Ezra was in the doorway, coat on, hat in his hand. There was sawdust on his shoulders, and fresh cold air came off him like a second presence. Good morning, she turned back to the skillet. The eggs were doing something. She wasn't entirely sure it was the right something. He came in, hung his coat and hat on the door pegs, and poured himself coffee. He stood behind her and to the left, not crowding her, just present, and looked at the skillet. She could feel him looking. Skillet needs to be hotter before the egg goes in, he said. Otherwise they stick. I know that now. Lard should have been smoking a little first. Yes, I've gathered that. A pause. You want me to? No. She kept her eyes on the eggs. I want to do it. He was quiet. He drank his coffee and leaned against the counter and did not offer further commentary, which she appreciated enormously. The eggs were not good. They were cooked through, which was arguably the minimum requirement for eggs. But they were brown on the bottom and ragged, and two of them had broken yolks. She slid them onto a plate and set it on the table, and sat down across from him and looked at them. He looked at them too, then he ate them without remark. They're terrible, she said. They're cooked, he said. First morning in a strange kitchen, that's good enough. She ate hers. They were, in fact, terrible, but she ate every bite. The trouble with the supper skillet happened that evening. She'd spent the day in useful occupation, going through Ezra's ledger books at his invitation, organizing the papers on his desk into some semblance of order, taking inventory of the larder, and writing out a supply list in her clear, architectural hand. The ledger work came naturally. She'd been keeping accounts for the family household since she was 16, and had an instinctive comfort with columns of numbers, the way some people were comfortable with music. His books were accurate, but chaotic. Entries crammed into margins, no consistent system for categorizing expenses, months of receipts tucked between pages in no discernible order. She didn't say any of this to him. She just started building a proper system from the beginning of the year, working forward. It was satisfying work, the kind where you could see your progress clearly, page by page, column by column. He came in and out throughout the day. He checked on her once, around noon, and looked at what she'd done so far, with an expression she couldn't fully read. He didn't say anything critical, he said. There's bread in the larder, and went back out. By late afternoon, she'd decided she would cook supper, not as a gesture of servitude. She was clear about that in her own mind. She was not doing it because it was expected of her, or because she felt she owed it. She was doing it because it was a thing that needed doing, and because she had watched him cook the night before and taken careful mental notes, and because she was not a woman who accepted incompetence in herself without a fight. She found the salt pork. She cut it the way she'd seen him cut it. She started the stove hot the way she now knew it needed to be, and she waited until the lard was nearly smoking before she put anything in. She had beans soaking in water since mid-morning. She'd seen the pot on the counter and understood what it meant and taken charge of it. The beans were fine. The beans were simple. They just needed time and occasional attention, and she was good at providing both. The salt pork was where things went wrong. It was the grease. She hadn't accounted for how much grease would come off the salt pork, or how hot the skillet would get, or what would happen when she tried to turn the meat with a long-handled fork, and the grease spat up against the back of her hand. She yanked her hand back. The fork caught the skillet handle. The skillet skidded on the stovetop. She grabbed it with her bare hand to stop it from falling. The sound she made was involuntary and brief, and she was embarrassed by it immediately. She set the skillet back in place with her uninjured hand. She stood at the stove and held her burned hand against her stomach and breathed very deliberately and evenly through what was happening to her palm and fingers. Ezra was in from the barn in under a minute. She hadn't called out. He must have heard the skillet scrape through the cabin wall. He came through the door and read the situation in about 2 seconds. Her posture, her hand held against her body, the slightly too controlled way she was breathing. "Let me see," he said. "I'm fine, Corinne." He said her name plainly, without sharpness, but with the kind of directness that didn't leave room for performance. "Let me see your hand." She held it out. He crossed the room and took her hand in both of his, cradling it. His hands were very large and very rough, calloused from fence wire and axe handles and rope. They were careful with her hand in a way that the rest of him, the hard jaw and the weathered coat, and the scar she'd glimpsed at the back of his collar this morning, didn't quite prepare you for. He turned her hand gently in the lamplight. The burns were across her palm, and the first 2 fingers red, and already beginning to blister. He set her hand down carefully, went to the shelf beside the washstand, and came back with a small tin. He sat down at the table and pulled the other chair around, so they were side by side, and gestured for her to sit. She sat. He opened the tin. It smelled of beeswax and something herbal she didn't recognize. He took a small amount on his fingertips and applied it to her palm with the same deliberate care he used for everything unhurried, thorough, his eyes on the work. It cooled the burning almost immediately. She released a breath she'd been holding for several minutes. He kept going, working the salve gently across the blistered skin, and he didn't say anything while he did it. Not a word of reproach, not a lecture about kitchen safety, not any form of "I told you so," which she'd half expected and been preparing herself for. When he'd finished, he tore a strip of clean cloth from a piece of muslin on the shelf and wrapped her hand loosely. Then he rolled up his sleeves. He did it practically folded, one cuff back, then the other, the way you did when you were about to do something that involved grease or water. He went to the stove, assessed the state of the salt pork and the beans with a brief, expert look, and picked up the fork. Schwaff watched him from the table. He finished the salt pork without drama. He checked the beans, tasted them, added a pinch of salt from the crock on the shelf. He cut the cornbread that remained from this morning's batch and put it on the table. He did all of it, the way he did most things competently, without ceremony, as if cooking supper alongside a burned stranger was simply the next practical task in a practical day. He put a plate in front of her and sat down across from her. She looked at the plate. She looked at him. "I should have been more careful with the grease," she said. "Now you know." He picked up his fork. "You'll know for next time. There'll be a next time. There'll be a great many next times," he said. "That's how learning works." He ate a bite. "You got the beans right. Beans are harder than people think. The timing matters." She looked down at her plate. The beans were, in fact, properly cooked soft through, but not turned to mush. well salted. She'd done that part. She ate a spoonful and allowed herself to feel quietly satisfied about it. I looked at your ledgers today, she said. I noticed your arithmetic is accurate. Your system is. She considered being diplomatic and decided against it. You don't have one. A system. You have accurate numbers, distributed randomly across several books with no consistent method of categorization. I know where everything is. You know where everything is right now. In January, when you're trying to compare this year's feed costs against last year's, or when you need to tell a bank or a creditor what your cattle revenue has been for the past 3 years, you won't know where anything is. He considered that. He ate another bite of salt pork. What would you do differently? I already started. I've organized the current year by month with separate columns for livestock, feed, labor, equipment, and miscellaneous. I flagged 3 entries that don't add up properly. I'll need you to look at them and tell me what they were for. She paused. Also, you're paying too much for the flour you've been ordering from Willow Creek. The mill outside Lander charges $1.50 less per hundredweight. If you order in bulk before winter, you'd save near $7 over the cold months. He looked at her for a moment. $7 is $7, he said. Yes, it is. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like a recalibration of some kind, a quiet adjustment to new information. He nodded. Once, the minimal nod of a man acknowledging a point. I'll take a look at those entries tonight, he said. After supper, with the dishes done, she washed them herself, awkwardly, with her wrapped hand, and he dried them and put them away without being asked and without comment. He sat at the table and placed a folded document in front of him. She came and sat across from him. He smoothed the document with one hand. It was several pages, written in his own hand on good paper denser, and more careful than his usual practical scrawl. He'd written this out deliberately. She could tell. He'd thought about it. I want to talk to you about the arrangement, he said. She folded her hands on the table. Her wrapped palm ached dully. All right, you came here under one set of expectations. Those expectations have changed from both sides. I want to be clear about what I'm offering and what I'm asking. He pushed the document toward her. I've written it out. I'd like you to read it. She picked it up and read it. It was a contract, a real one, structured the way legal agreements were structured, with numbered clauses and defined terms. He'd titled it simply, Trial Agreement between E. Vance and C. Leclerc, Broken Elbow Ranch, September 1874. The terms were straightforward. A period of 3 months, running from the date of her arrival to the 1st of December. During that time, she would serve as the ranch's bookkeeper and correspondence manager all accounts, letters, invoices, and records. In exchange, he would provide room, board, and a monthly wage of $12. He would also, during those 3 months, teach her the practical skills she lacked, cooking properly, writing, basic animal husbandry, how to preserve food for winter, how to handle a firearm. The contract specified that the teaching was not optional. It wasn't a courtesy or an extra. It was written in as part of his obligations under the agreement. She would learn. He would teach. Both of these were things they had agreed to do. At the end of 3 months, she could leave. If she chose to, he would provide the cost of a stagecoach ticket to any destination she named, back east or otherwise, no questions and no dispute. Or she could stay. If she stayed, the arrangement would be renegotiated then, in December, with full knowledge of what the work actually was and what both of them were actually capable of. Whatever came after that would be decided with open eyes. She read it twice. She read the wage clause again. $12 a month was a working woman's wage, a real one, not a token payment. She'd known women in Philadelphia who worked as seamstresses for 6. She set the document down. The teaching, she said. You've written it as an obligation on your part. It is. Most men in your position would consider it a favor, something the woman should be grateful for. Most men in my position would be wrong. He looked at her directly. You came out here with skills that are useful to this ranch. I came into this with skills you don't have yet. That's not a hierarchy. That's just two different starting points. He tapped the contract once with one finger. By December, we should both know something we didn't before. She looked at the contract, then at him. What is your honest reason for writing it as a formal agreement? She said, rather than simply telling me the terms and expecting me to take them on faith. He didn't hesitate, because you've been in a situation where you had no recourse when terms were changed on you, where verbal understandings meant nothing, and there was no written protection. He sat back. A contract puts the terms in writing. It makes them real. If I ever broke what's written there, you'd have grounds to hold me to account. That matters. She was quiet for a moment. She had grown up in a world where women signed documents they had no power to negotiate and were bound by agreements they'd never consented to in the first place. She'd watched her mother do it. She'd watched her aunts do it. She'd been very nearly required to do it herself. This man had written her a contract that specified her recourse if he failed. That gave her the right to leave. That called his teaching of her a duty rather than a benevolence. It was such a simple thing, and it was so completely unlike anything she'd encountered before that she had to hold very still for a moment until the feeling it produced in her settled somewhere manageable. I want to change one clause, she said. Tell me. The wage. $12 a month is fair for what you've described, but I want it paid weekly rather than monthly. $3 each Friday. He considered it. Why? Because I have never in my adult life had money that was mine, paid to me on a schedule I could count on. Monthly feels too much like an allowance. Weekly feels like a wage. She held his gaze. It's the same total. It costs you nothing, but it matters to me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he took the contract back and picked up his pen and made a small amendment to the wage clause. He turned it back toward her so she could read what he'd written. Payable each Friday in equal installments. Anything else? He said. She read the document a third time, top to bottom, carefully. She found nothing else she wanted to change. Every clause was what it claimed to be. Every obligation was defined clearly. The language was plain, and the intent was honest. No, she said. This is fair. All right. He turned the contract to face her and held out the pen. She signed it. He signed it. He folded it into thirds and placed it on the shelf where she now knew the lamp oil was kept, which meant he would see it regularly, and it would not be forgotten or misplaced. Then he said, First lesson starts tomorrow. What is it? Fire, he said. Starting one, maintaining one, knowing when it's right and when it's wrong. On the stove and in the open. Out here, a person who can't build and control a fire is in serious trouble. He stood up and began banking the cook stove for the night, adjusting the damper, the draft, settling the coals in their correct arrangement. It's not complicated, but it takes practice. She watched his hands. I can do complicated, she said. I know that. Fire's not complicated. It's just precise. He closed the stove door. There's a difference. Complicated means many parts. Precise means you have to care about the details. I care about details. I've noticed. He straightened up. You'll do fine. She sat at the table with the lamp burning low and looked at where the contract now lived on the shelf. Her name in her own handwriting on a document she had read and considered and chosen to sign. In her whole life, she could count on one hand the number of times she had signed her name to something she had actually chosen. Outside, the wind pushed against the logs. In the barn, something moved, a horse shifting or the dog settling, and the sound came through the walls like a reassurance, something large and calm, doing the simple work of being present. She sat in the warm cabin in Wyoming, 7 miles from the nearest town, in a world so foreign to everything she'd known that it might as well have been the surface of the moon. She thought about the contract on the shelf, about the man who had written recourse into her rights before she'd asked for it. About the fact that in 2 days she'd learned to start a cook fire and gauge stove heat and soak beans and season cast iron and walk on new ground in borrowed shoes. About the $12, $3. That would be hers on Friday. She got up. She refilled her water glass from the pitcher. She went to the bookshelf and looked at the spines until she found Montaigne, and she carried it to her room. She read it by the light of a small candle until her eyes grew heavy. Then she blew the candle out and lay in the dark and listened to the wind doing its work against the cabin walls, all through the long Wyoming night. She was already thinking about the fire lesson, already mapping it in her mind. What she knew, what she still needed to understand, what questions she would ask. In the morning, she would get up before the sun. She would dress and go to the stove and practice what she'd learned about the damper and the draft. She would have the coffee made. Before he came in from his first round of the morning, she was almost certain she could do it. She fell asleep on that certainty, and the wind blew, and the fire in the cook stove breathed its slow, measured breath through the night. October arrived without apology. One morning the sky was the hard, clean blue of early fall, and by afternoon it had gone the color of an old bruised purple-gray from the northwest, the kind of sky that cattlemen read, the way other people read newspapers. Ezra looked at it once from the corral fence and went directly inside to add a third layer of wood to the stack on the porch. Corinne noticed. She noticed most things now. 6 weeks at the broken elbow had done something to her attention. She'd arrived in Wyoming looking at the landscape the way a person looks at a painting, something to observe, from a respectful distance, flat and foreign and belonging to someone else. Now she looked at it differently. The way the cattle moved told you something about predators. The way the horses held their heads told you something about weather. The way the creek sounded through the cottonwoods changed before a freeze, lower and slower, like it was conserving itself. She had not expected to find any of this interesting. She found it deeply interesting. She had also, in 6 weeks, learned to build a fire that drew properly on the first try, to make cornbread that didn't taste like chalk, to ride Ezra's older mare, a tolerant bay named Prudence, at a working trot without gripping the saddle horn, and to field strip and clean the Winchester without cutting herself, which had taken 4 attempts and 1 minor laceration before she mastered it. The ledgers were in excellent order. She'd reconfigured the entire bookkeeping system, trained Ezra to enter expenses in the correct column on the correct page, and had already saved him $14 in supply costs through bulk purchasing and a new arrangement with the Lander Mill that she'd negotiated by letter in his name, which he'd signed without altering a single word. She'd sent the letter herself. He'd paid her first $3 installment on the first Friday, and every Friday since. She kept the coins in a small drawstring pouch inside her trunk. She took them out sometimes, not count them. She knew what was there, but just to hold them, just to feel the weight. Real money, hers. It was the 3rd week of October, when Ezra came in from the eastern pasture with news. She was at the desk when he came through the door, and she knew from the set of his shoulders that something was wrong before he said a word. "Missing cattle," he said. He took his coat off and went to the stove to warm his hands. 11 head from the east pasture. The fence is down in a section, clean cut, not broken. She turned in the chair. Clean cut. Wire cutters. Someone did it deliberately. He looked at the stove. 3 sets of boot prints on the far side of the fence, heading northeast toward Pike's territory. She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned back to the ledger she'd been working on. The current month's cattle count, organized by pasture location. "Sit down," she said. "I want to show you something." He came and sat. She turned the ledger to face him and pointed to a column she'd marked with a small asterisk 3 weeks prior. "I noticed a discrepancy when I was working through August," she said. 17 head unaccounted for over 2 months. The purchase records show them bought. The feed costs reflect them. But the quarterly count you gave me for August is 17 short. She turned to a second page. I didn't say anything yet because I wanted to see if September confirmed it. It does. You're losing cattle at a rate that's consistent with systematic rustling, not casual loss. He looked at the numbers. He studied them the way he studied everything, without rushing, without reacting until he understood what he was looking at. 17 in August, he said. 11 now. 28 head over approximately 8 weeks. At current beef prices, that's somewhere between $400 and $450 in stolen livestock. She tapped the page. This is not random. Someone knows your pasture rotations. They know which sections have poor sight lines. They're working a pattern. He looked up at her. You figured this out from the ledger. The ledger tells you where the numbers don't agree with each other. Numbers don't lie. They just show you where someone else has been lying. She closed the book. Who knows your rotation schedule? I never thought to keep it secret. Anyone who's ridden this land long enough could work it out. He sat back. Pike's had his eye on the eastern pasture for 2 years. It's where the best grass is, and it sits above the spring that feeds his lower range. He controls the creek, but the spring's on my land. Can you prove the connection between Pike and the missing cattle? Not yet. Then we need to be careful about how we respond, she said. A man with Pike's money and Pike's lawyers will use any hasty move against you. You'd be better served documenting every loss with dates, locations, and physical evidence than riding over to his spread and making accusations you can't currently support. He was quiet for a moment. You've thought about this. I've thought about men like Pike, she said. They rely on the people they harm being either too frightened or too angry to think clearly. Fear makes you stay silent. Anger makes you move too fast. Both of those outcomes serve him, she met his eyes. Good records don't. He looked at her for a long moment. Start a separate ledger, he said. Just for the losses. Every detail you have. I already did, she said, and turned to the last page of the current book, where she'd begun exactly that 3 weeks ago. He looked at it. He didn't smile. He rarely smiled, she'd learned, but something in his expression settled into a kind of solid, quiet satisfaction. Right, he said. Tomorrow we ride east and document the fence. They rode out at first light, when the air was sharp enough to make your eyes. Water and the grass in the lower pasture was stiff with frost. Prudence moved well under Corinne in the cold. The mare was sensible and steady, not a horse that used weather as an excuse for theatrics. Ezra rode his big roan, a horse named Calhoun, who was almost comically mismatched with his rider. In temperament, where Ezra was contained, Calhoun was opinionated about everything. They documented the fence line together. Ezra showed her how to read the ground boot prints, hoof prints, the particular way disturbed soil held evidence in cold, dry conditions. She listened and looked and asked questions that were worth answering. He told her what the marks meant, and she committed it to memory. The cut fence was exactly as he described, deliberate, professional, the work of someone who knew what they were doing and was not rushing. They repaired it. She held the wire and learned to use the fencing pliers while he set the staples. She cut herself once on the barb. She put her finger in her mouth and kept working. On the ride back, they came around the edge of the high eastern ridge, and the landscape opened up south miles of sage flats, running down to where the creek bent, and beyond that, the darker line of timber at the base of the mountains. It's enormous, she said. She'd thought it before, but she was always slightly surprised by it. The sheer scale of the country, every time a ridge or a rise brought new miles into view. Frightened you when you got here, Ezra said. Not unkindly. Terrified me, she said. I felt like I'd stepped off the edge of the world. She looked south along the flat. Now it just looks like there's room. Room for what? She thought about it honestly. Room to be a different size, she said. In Philadelphia, everything was arranged very precisely. What you wore, who you spoke to, what you were allowed to want. The architecture of the place enforced all of it: narrow streets, tall buildings, everyone pressed together and watched constantly. She paused. Here there's room to move without anyone measuring the movement. He said nothing, but he was listening. She had learned to tell when he was listening, a particular quality of his silence, more present than absence. "Does it get lonely?" she asked, living this far out, this far from. The shot of sound hit before she processed what it was. Not a gunshot, something larger, more primitive. A deep concussive crack from the timberline to their left, followed immediately by crashing heavy, fast, wrong in a way that moved up your spine before your mind caught up with it. Calhoun shied hard. Prudence froze. The grizzly came out of the timber at speed. It was enormous. Corinne had read about grizzly bears in the natural history books she'd consumed as a girl, and she had looked at illustrations in magazines, and none of that had prepared her for the physical reality of the animal in motion, the sheer brown mass of it, the sound its feet made on frozen ground, the low, terrible efficiency of how fast it moved for how large it was. Prudence decided in the next half-second that she had honored her obligations to the situation and departed at full gallop. Corinne had 2 seconds of furious, lucid riding, staying low, seat deep in the saddle, turning the mare to the left toward the slope of the ridge the way Ezra had taught her, before Prudence hit an icy patch and went sideways. She went over the mare's left shoulder. The slope caught her. Stone, frozen ground, and then the ledge of a rock outcropping that ended the fall with a collision so complete it knocked every thought out of her head. She lay against the rock and breathed, and the world was white for a moment. Then sound returned. Ezra's voice, sharp, commanding, and a sound she didn't want to identify, and then a horse screaming briefly, and then silence. Then nothing but her own breathing, and the wind and the distant sound of Prudence galloping away through frozen grass. She tried to sit up. Her right arm refused. The shoulder moved wrong. She could feel it move wrong in a way that was so specifically, brilliantly awful that she went back down against the rock and pressed her face to the ground and breathed very carefully and did not make any sound. Ezra was there in minutes. She heard him, scrambling down the slope. "Corinne, here," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. He crouched beside her. His hands were on her, in a moment quick, systematic, checking. He had blood on his left forearm, a long set of dark lines through the torn coat sleeve that she couldn't look at properly right now. "Your back hit the rock," he said. "My shoulder," she managed. "I think it's dislocated." He confirmed it with a brief, careful touch to the joint. His face did something complicated and then went still. "You're right, it is." "How bad?" "Bad enough that it needs to go back in now, not later." He glanced at the sky. She looked too. The sky had turned overnight into the sky she'd been watching come in for a week. That purple-gray mass moving fast from the northwest, dropping as it moved. The temperature had fallen 20 degrees since morning. "There's a cave shelter 100 yards up the ridge." "Can you walk?" Yes, she could walk. It was not pleasant, but she could walk because the alternative was lying on frozen ground while a blizzard came in. And she had made a general policy decision about her life that she was not going to accept alternatives that were worse than the thing she was afraid of. He kept pace beside her up the slope. He did not offer to carry her. He seemed to understand that being carried was not what she wanted, but his hand was at her left elbow, steady there if she needed it. When she stumbled on a loose rock, his grip tightened for exactly the 3 seconds she needed and then eased back. The cave was more of a deep overhang 10 feet deep, cut into the cliff face by whatever ancient water had carved the ridge. It blocked the wind, which was already building. Ezra had the fire going in under 10 minutes from materials he carried in his saddle pack without planning for this specific situation, but apparently planning for something like it, because he always had tinder and a flint and a length of cord and a folded piece of waxed canvas. She sat against the back wall of the overhang, with her arm held close to her body, and watched him build the fire. Outside, the sky was going fast. The snow began while he was coaxing the flame to the larger sticks, horizontal and dense, driving in from the northwest, the kind of snow that meant business. He came and sat beside her. The fire was small but effective. The overhang trapped the heat. "Tell me what's going to happen," she said. Specifically. He respected that. He'd learned in 6 weeks that she wanted specific information, not managed information. "The shoulder has to be relocated into the socket," he said. "I've done it before. It's a clean dislocation, no bone fracture, that I can find, which is the good news. The bad news is that the procedure is very painful. There's no way around that." She looked at the fire. "How painful?" "Bad enough that most people fight it involuntarily. Your body doesn't want me to do what I'm going to do, even though it's the right thing. You'll need to stay as still as you can and try not to pull against me." He paused. "If you don't have it set now, there's muscle damage that can become permanent. Weeks of impairment at minimum. Possibly longer-term problems with the joint. So not doing it isn't actually an option. Not a good one," she breathed. The fire cracked. Outside, the blizzard had arrived in full. The sound of it was enormous and constant, the wind doing violence to every exposed surface of the ridge. She turned and looked at him directly. The firelight caught the angles of his face, the old saber scar at the back of his collar that she'd noticed before, and never asked about. His eyes were steady on her. The blood on his arm had darkened, but hadn't soaked through further. She registered that and filed it for after. "All right," she said. "Tell me what to do. I'm going to move your arm through a specific rotation, slow and controlled. When the bone gets close to the socket, there'll be a point where it feels like it's getting worse before it gets better." He held her gaze. "At that point, you need to stay with me. Don't lock up. Don't pull back. Stay with you," she repeated. "I understand." He moved around behind her. She could feel the warmth of him at her back. He was blocking the draft from the cave. Mouth, she realized. He'd positioned himself that way deliberately. His hands came to her shoulder. Careful, precise. He began the rotation. The first movement was manageable, uncomfortable, the joint protesting everything, but manageable. She breathed the way he'd taught her to breathe when she'd been panicked during a hard ride in her second week. Through the nose, 4 counts, out through the mouth, 4 counts. Give the body something to follow. The second movement was not manageable. Pain arrived like a wave that didn't break. It just built and built. Pressure and fire, and a wrongness so total that every instinct she had rose up at once and screamed at her to stop, to pull back, to do anything except sit still and let this continue. Her hand shot up and grabbed the front of his coat. Her fingers found the lapel and gripped. She heard her own voice, ragged, fractured, stripped of everything she normally kept, between herself and the world. "It hurts too much." Ezra went still. Not stopped, she could feel that he hadn't stopped the movement. He'd controlled it, holding the position at the critical point without retreating. His voice came from behind her, low and close. "I know, Corinne. Breathe with me." He breathed, audibly, slowly. In through the nose, she followed. Because there was nothing else to do. Because his voice was the only stable thing in the middle of everything that was happening, and her body, desperate for anything solid to hold on to, chose to follow it. Out through the mouth, in. The pull came on the exhale swift, practiced, a single controlled motion, and the sound that followed was terrible, and the pain that followed, that was so sudden and so complete that she didn't entirely remain present for it. She was aware of it, the way you were aware of lightning in the flash, and then in the after. Then it was over. The joint was back. She could feel it. The fundamental rightness of the bone where it belonged, underneath the swelling and the throbbing that would be there for days. But right, set. She was still gripping his coat. She let go. She became aware that she was trembling her. Whole body fine and continuous. The kind of trembling that was not fear exactly, but the aftermath of the body going through something it didn't want to go through and surviving it anyway. Ezra came around in front of her. He looked at her face. He seemed to assess something from it and find it acceptable. Then he took off his sheepskin coat. It was the big one, the heaviest thing she'd seen him wear, lined with thick wool, enormous on him, and more enormous when he put it around her shoulders. It smelled of horses and wood smoke, and the particular cold and leather smell that she had come to associate specifically with him, which was strange, only because she'd been in Philadelphia 6 weeks ago and had no associations of any kind with leather or horses or wood smoke. He pulled it around her, both sides together, overlapping. It covered her from shoulders to knees. He sat back. He was in his flannel shirt and his vest, and the temperature in the cave, with the small fire going, was somewhere around 20 degrees above what it was outside. He didn't acknowledge the cold. He just looked at the fire and added a stick to it. "Your arm," she said. He glanced down at his left arm. "It's fine." "It's not fine. It's from the bear. It's cleaned up enough for now." He looked at her. "Stop arguing and sleep if you can. Blizzard like this usually runs 8 to 12 hours. We'll ride out when it breaks." She looked at him for a moment. He had thrown himself between her and a grizzly bear. She understood that now, the positioning, the sequence of events, the wounds on his arm, that were deep enough that she could see the dark lines of them through the torn fabric. He had put himself between her and that animal without, as far as she could tell, calculating it, or deciding it, or doing anything except doing it. She wanted to say something about that. She couldn't find the words that felt accurate. Everything that came to mind was either too small or too large for the space between them. "Thank you," she said. It was insufficient. She said it anyway. "Don't mention it," he said. He meant it, literally. She understood that about him by now, that some things he did simply did not require acknowledgement in his accounting of events, and the mention of them was more awkward for him than the doing of them. She leaned back against the cave wall, inside his enormous coat, and looked at the fire. Outside, the blizzard made its sound, the long, sustained, totally committed roar of weather, in a place where weather had nothing to restrain it. The cave shook slightly at the gusts. The fire bent toward the back wall, and then straightened again. She slept, eventually, not comfortably, with her shoulder throbbing, and the cold pressing in at the edges, but genuinely slept. When she woke, the fire had been rebuilt smaller but steady, carefully managed. The blizzard was still going. Her shoulder was wrapped in a strip of flannel from his pack, binding it close to her body. He was sitting at the cave mouth with his back to her, watching the storm. He'd put on his riding jacket over the vest. He was watching the dark. Past him, she could see the snow driving sideways in the firelight, thick and determined. He was keeping watch. He'd been keeping watch the whole time, she understood. He hadn't slept. The fire had been fed through the night, and the cave had stayed at its marginal warmth because he'd maintained it. And no predator had come near the entrance because he was sitting at it with the Winchester across his knees. She sat with that for a moment. The fact of it. What it meant that a man did a thing like that quietly, without drama, without requiring you to notice. She decided she noticed anyway. She pulled the sheepskin coat tighter around her shoulders and looked at the back of his head in the cave mouth and thought about 6 weeks ago. The stagecoach depot, the dust, the mountains that had terrified her, the work shoes he'd put in her hands in the failing light. She had signed a contract for 3 months. The 3 months would end in December. She was aware, sitting in the cave on the 3rd night of October, with his coat around her and the blizzard outside, that she had not thought about December once in the past 2 weeks. Had not been performing mental calculations about where she would go, or what she would do, or whether the 3 months were passing quickly enough. Had not been watching the calendar the way a person did when they were tolerating a situation, rather than living inside it. She wasn't entirely sure what that meant. She filed it carefully, the way she filed ledger entries that required further examination before conclusions could be drawn. The blizzard blew. The fire burned. He kept watch. She went back to sleep. It broke around mid-morning. The roar went to a sound, and the sound went to wind, and the wind went to the particular kind of quiet that only existed after a major storm. A silence so complete it had texture. She heard it change and opened her eyes. He was still at the cave mouth. The light was different, gray-white, snow light, winter light. Beyond him the world was white. "It's over," he said without turning. "I know." She sat up carefully, managing her shoulder. "How bad is the snow?" 18 inches, maybe more. "Passable on horseback." He stood. Calhoun held. "He's in the timber about 50 yards west. I can see his tracks." He finally turned and looked at her. Prudence will have gone back to the barn. She knows her way. She stood up. She was stiff from the cold and the rock and the hours of the night, and her shoulder would be a problem for days. But she was upright and functional, and that was the relevant condition. She handed him his coat. He took it and put it on without comment. They came out of the cave, into the new snow, and the white silence of the Wind River Valley, where every surface was remade, and the peaks to the north and west were brilliant against the sky, in a way that was, she would later try to describe in a letter she never sent to anyone, so beautiful it was almost aggressive. She stood in the snow outside the cave and looked at it. Her breath made clouds in the cold air. "This territory," she said. "I know," he said. He went to get the horse. She stood in the snow and breathed the sharp, clean air, and her shoulder ached, and her back was bruised from the ridge, and she had survived a grizzly bear and a blizzard in a cliffside cave, with a quiet man who kept watch all night. And the valley lay below them in its white winter dress, enormous and indifferent and completely, absolutely beautiful. She followed him to where the horse waited. They rode home through the new snow together, close enough that their horses' shoulders occasionally touched on the narrow track, and the cold made everything clean. And the ranch came into view around the last bend, with smoke rising straight up from the chimney in the still morning air. She looked at the smoke. She felt it, the pull of it, the particular way a place called you back. She did not examine the feeling too carefully. She just rode toward it. The trip to Willow Creek was Corinne's idea. She'd been tracking the supply situation in the ledger for 2 weeks, and the numbers were unambiguous. Winter was coming in hard. The early blizzard on the ridge had been a warning, not a preview, and the ranch needed flour, salt, lamp oil, dried fruit, and 2 kinds of medicine before the passes got serious. She laid all of this out for Ezra one evening at the table with the ledger open and her finger moving down the columns, and he looked at it and said they'd go Thursday. He said it like that was the whole conversation. She was learning that most of his conversations were short on one end. Thursday came in cold and clear. Corinne wore the heaviest dress she'd brought from Philadelphia, which was not heavy enough, and over it a wool riding coat she'd found, folded in the trunk in her room, left by someone previous, she assumed, but she didn't ask because it fit well enough and kept the wind off, and there were some questions that didn't need answers. She'd pinned her hair up tight under a wool hat and pulled on the gloves Ezra had handed her without comment during her second week. Her shoulder was mostly healed, still stiff in the cold, with a deep ache that came and went, depending on how she moved, but functional. She'd been careful with it. Ezra had been careful with it, in a way that required her not to acknowledge he was being careful, which she'd managed. The buckboard felt different in October than it had in September. In September, she'd sat on that bench and felt the distance between herself and everything familiar as a kind of vertigo. Now she just felt the cold and the road, and the particular way the sage flats caught the low morning light silver and amber, the frost not quite burned off yet. She watched the landscape the way she'd been watching it for 6 weeks, looking for what it was telling her. They came into Willow Creek around mid-morning. The town was not large. A main street with a row of false-fronted buildings, a livery at one end and a feed store at the other, a saloon in the middle that seemed to be the town's center of gravity, a mercantile, a small bank, a church that needed paint, wooden sidewalks that kept you 2 inches above the mud, most of which had frozen solid in the night. People were out, not many, but enough. A woman in a calico dress, carrying a basket. 2 men talking outside the feed store who looked at the buckboard when it passed. a boy of about 12 running some errand at full speed, too committed to his task to spare a glance. Corinne had learned to read social terrain almost before she learned to read written words. Growing up in New Orleans and then Philadelphia, in houses where the wrong expression at the wrong moment could mean a week of cold meals and closed doors, you developed an instinct for the room, for where the attention was and what it meant. The attention here was not friendly, not hostile, exactly. Something more sideways than that. The kind of attention that watches from the corner of its eye and speaks behind its hand. The woman with the basket glanced at Corinne and then away, and then said something to the woman standing next to her at the dry goods window that made both of them look. She felt it. She registered it without reacting to it, which was a skill she'd been practicing since she was about 7 years old. Ezra pulled the buckboard up in front of the mercantile and climbed down. She climbed down on her own side. He glanced at her over the buckboard and seemed to read something in her face. "Town's not used to Newport," he said. "I noticed. It'll settle." She looked at the two women who were still watching from across the street. "Will it?" He looked. "Mostly," he said. He held the mercantile door. Inside was warm and smelled of sawdust and dried herbs and coffee. The storekeeper was a man named Garfield, heavyset, with a professional affability that Corinne recognized as the kind that covered a more private set of opinions. He greeted Ezra by name and looked at Corinne with a curiosity he was trying to up as courtesy. She handed him her supply list. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. She'd written it in her clear, architectural hand, organized by category, with quantities specified and the mill arrangement for the flour noted at the bottom, with a reference to the letter she'd sent in September. "The flour's already accounted for under the lander arrangement," she said pleasantly. "We'll take the rest of this today." He looked at the list again. Something in his expression recalibrated slightly, the professional affability adjusting itself to accommodate the fact that the woman in front of him knew exactly what she was doing. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She moved through the mercantile while he began filling the order. She looked at what was available for the kitchen, checked the quality of the dried fruit, examined the salt situation, found a tin of dried lavender that she almost put back and then didn't, because there was no rule that everything in a ranch kitchen had to be purely functional. She found a bottle of willow bark tincture and 2 lengths of good flannel. She was examining the lamp oil when she heard it. The women had come in, 2 of them, the calico dress and her companion, a taller woman in brown wool. They went to the fabric section on the far side of the store and spoke in voices calibrated precisely to carry, without appearing to be aimed at anyone. "Mail order," said the calico dress. The brown wool had the practiced vocal neutrality of someone who enjoyed this kind of conversation. You can tell that silk was something, apparently, before she ruined it. "Well," a pause with social content. "What else does a woman bring out here when she's been bought and paid for?" Corinne put the lamp oil carefully on the counter. She was very still for a moment. It was a particular kind of stillness. Not frozen, not flinching. The stillness of a person deciding what to do with something they've been handed that they didn't ask for. She was aware of Ezra. He was at the back of the store looking at rope, or had been. She didn't look at him. She thought about what she wanted here. What response would actually serve her? In Philadelphia, she'd spent years navigating the social territory of people who wielded gossip the way other people wielded weapons precisely, with plausible deniability aimed at the joints. She'd watched women be destroyed by it and women survive it, and the difference was almost always the same thing: what you dignified with your attention and what you didn't. She picked up the lamp oil and walked to the counter. But she also, as she passed the fabric section, made brief, pleasant eye contact with both women. Not challenging, not warm. Exactly the degree of acknowledgement that said, "I heard you. I'm not concerned. Have a lovely morning." The calico dress looked away first. Small victories were still victories. Garfield had most of the order assembled by the time Ezra came to the counter. They settled the account. Ezra paid. Corinne had already done the arithmetic and told him the total before Garfield announced it, which made the storekeeper blink, and they began carrying things out to the buckboard. It was on the third trip out that she saw him. He was coming down the wooden sidewalk from the direction of the saloon, and he moved the way very powerful. Men moved in places where their power was total and known, without hurry, without the small accommodations that most people made for the people around them. People moved for him, slightly, unconsciously, the way water moves around a rock. He was perhaps 48, broad through the shoulders, dressed in the kind of clothes that cost money, but were trying not to look like they cost money, a prosperous rancher's clothes, rather than a wealthy man's, which was itself a kind of calculation. His face was clean-shaven and arranged in an expression of general goodwill that didn't quite reach his eyes, which were a flat, particular gray, the color of a sky that had already decided what weather it was going to make. He saw Ezra. He smiled. He came directly to them. Vance. He extended his hand. Ezra shook it. One shake. He didn't return the smile. Pike, he said. Bartholomew Pike. She knew the name from the ledgers. It had appeared in the margins of Ezra's notes, in letters from the county office, in a context that was never neutral. She'd built a fairly complete picture of him from documents alone before she'd ever set eyes on him, and the man in front of her matched the picture in most ways. Wealthier looking than she'd imagined. Smother. Pike turned to her. He performed a small version of a bow, the kind of gesture that in Philadelphia would have been considered correct, and that out here, she suspected, was being used to signal something different than courtesy. And this must be the new addition to the Broken Elbow household, he said. His voice was rich, well modulated, the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to in rooms. Bartholomew Pike, I believe your employer and I are old acquaintances. She held out her hand. Corinne Leclerc. She did not correct the employer. He shook it and held it half a beat longer than necessary. You've come a long way, Miss Leclerc. From Philadelphia, yes. A brave undertaking. The territory can be. His gaze moved very briefly to the mountains and back, challenging for someone unaccustomed to it. I'm accustoming myself, she said pleasantly. He smiled. It was a good smile, technically excellent. She'd known men in Philadelphia who smiled like that, who'd spent years understanding that a smile was a tool, not an expression, and who deployed it accordingly. The smile said, I'm charming, which means I'm safe. She'd stopped believing that equation around the age of 16. He turned back to Ezra. Good timing, actually. I've been meaning to ride out to the Broken Elbow, but he spread his hands in a gesture of cheerful helplessness. A man gets busy. I imagine, Ezra said. I wanted to talk again about the Creek Run situation. The survey we discussed in June. Pike reached inside his coat and produced a folded document with the ease of a man who'd prepared for this encounter and was presenting the preparation as coincidence. I had my lawyer draw up something that I think addresses your concerns. Much simpler than what we talked about before. He held it out. Ezra didn't take it immediately. Pike set it on the buckboard's sideboard open. Corinne looked at it. She didn't touch it. She read it from where she stood. She read fast. It was a skill she'd developed early. Her father's household had run on documents, and she'd been reading adult correspondence since she was 10, absorbing the structure and language of legal papers by osmosis. She read the first page, the key clauses, the definitions section that was tucked at the back, where most people didn't bother. Most people, not her. She saw it on the third paragraph of the second page. It was elegant, as these things went. The language on the surface was about water access rights along the tributary that ran between Ezra's eastern pasture and Pike's lower range, a genuine point of contention that had legitimate history. The proposed terms looked reasonable in the first reading: a shared use arrangement, a specified schedule, maintenance obligations divided between the parties. But the definitions section, specifically the definition of permanent easement in Clause 4, cross-referenced with the maintenance obligation in Clause 7. If Ezra signed this, and then under the deliberately vague language of failure to maintain, was found in breach of Clause 7, the easement would convert automatically to a full transfer of water rights. No cure period, no arbitration, a direct, irrevocable transfer, and the maintenance standard in Clause 7 was written broadly enough that Pike's lawyer could argue breach under almost any circumstance he chose. She picked up the document. Pike's eyes moved to her. Something shifted in them, very slight. He'd registered the action. "Miss Leclerc," he said. His tone was friendly, amused, the kind of amused that had a different thing underneath it. "I'm sure Mr. Vance can manage. I'm the bookkeeper," she said without looking up from the document, "and the correspondence manager." She turned the page. "I review all agreements before Mr. Vance considers them. It's more efficient." A beat of silence. She kept reading. "Of course," Pike said. She turned to the definitions section. She read Clause 4. She read Clause 7. She read the cross-reference. She went back to the front and read the recitals paragraph, which was the most important paragraph in most legal documents and the one most people skipped because it looked ceremonial and wasn't. The recitals paragraph established the framing. It described Ezra's ranch as currently operating at reduced capacity due to cattle losses language that could later be used to argue financial stress and therefore eagerness to sign. Preloaded justification for claiming the signature was freely given. She looked up. They were both watching her. Ezra, with his neutral, patient attention. Pike, with his excellent smile, which had been doing a great deal of work in the last 2 minutes. There were people on the sidewalk. Garfield had come to the mercantile door. The two women from inside had drifted closer, a small, natural accumulation of attention. The kind that happened in a small town when something interesting was unfolding in a public place. She was aware of all of it. She accounted for it and set it aside and spoke to the specific practical matter. "This easement agreement has a problem," she said. Her voice was conversational, not raised. There was no theater in it. She wasn't performing for the sidewalk audience. She was simply saying true things clearly. Clause 7 establishes a maintenance obligation, but the definition of maintenance failure in Section 4 is broad enough to include. She turned to the relevant paginee diminishment in water volume attributable to acts, omissions, or natural conditions occurring on or adjacent to the Vance parcel. Natural conditions. She looked up at Pike. That would include drought, a dry season, an upstream blockage caused by a beaver. It's written to give your legal counsel grounds for claiming breach under circumstances entirely outside Mr. Vance's control. Silence. Pike's smile hadn't moved. It was doing an impressive amount of work, holding its position. "And when breach is found," she continued, "the easement converts to a full transfer of water rights under Clause 4. No cure period, no arbitration provision, a direct transfer." She folded the document and held it out to him. "I'd also note that the recitals describe the broken elbow as operating at reduced capacity due to cattle losses, which is language that doesn't appear in the factual record and would seem to be establishing a narrative about financial distress that doesn't currently exist." She held his gaze. "This agreement is not what it appears to be. On first reading, Mr. Vance won't be signing it." The silence was different now. On the sidewalk, Garfield had been joined by the feed store man. The two women weren't pretending to look elsewhere anymore. Pike's smile made a small, controlled adjustment. He picked up the document. He looked at it briefly, as if reassuring himself that it was the same document he'd produced and not something she'd substituted. "Miss Leclerc," he said, "I appreciate your diligence, but perhaps this is a conversation for the people whose names are on the agreement," she said, "which is Mr. Vance and you. I've given him my assessment. He'll make his own decision." She stepped back and looked at Ezra. Ezra was looking at her. He had the expression he got sometimes when she did something that required him to quietly update his understanding of a situation. He wore it briefly, and then it was gone, replaced by the ordinary, still surface of his face. He looked at Pike. "You heard her," he said. Pike stood with the document in his hand. His smile was present, but doing different work now, managing something rather than projecting something. He looked at Corinne once more. It was not the look of a man who was angry. Exactly. It was the look of a man who was filing information. "Well," he said pleasantly, "perhaps we can find a simpler arrangement. No rush." He tucked the document back inside his coat. He touched his hat brim to Ezra, and then, with a deliberateness that was its own kind of message to her, "Miss LeClaire, a pleasure." He walked away down the sidewalk. Not quickly, the pace of a man who did not need to appear to be retreating. She watched him go. She turned to load the remaining supplies onto the buckboard. Garfield, in the mercantile doorway, cleared his throat. "You need a hand with those boxes?" "We're fine," Ezra said. "Thank you, Garfield." The man nodded and went back inside. The accumulated sidewalk audience dispersed slowly, reluctantly, the way small-town audiences dispersed when a scene concluded before they were ready. She lifted a box of dried goods and set it in the buckboard. Her shoulder objected briefly. She ignored it. Corinne, she turned. Ezra was standing at his side of the buckboard, holding a crate of lamp oil. He wasn't looking at her the way Pike had looked at her, or the way the women inside had looked at her, or the way Garfield had looked at her. He was looking at her, the way he looked at things he found significant, and was still determining how to address. "That was good work," he said. Just that. 4 words. Plain and specific, in the way his things always were. No decoration, no qualification, no performance of being impressed. Just the statement of a fact he'd observed. She felt it more than she expected to. "I read the definition section," she said. "Most people don't. I know." She turned back to the buckboard. "That's why he wrote it that way." They loaded the rest of the supplies in a working silence that was not uncomfortable. The morning had sharpened the cold further, and her breath was making small clouds in the still air. She was thinking about the definitions section, about the recitals paragraph, about the fact that Bartholomew Pike had arrived in that encounter with a document already drafted and had the production of it ready to look like coincidence. He'd been expecting them. He had sources in town, or he'd simply known that a ranch needing supplies before winter would come to Willow Creek on a reasonable schedule. It didn't matter how he knew. What mattered was that the document was ready, and it was specifically designed for a man who'd sign it without reading the definitions section, which most men in Ezra's position would have done. She thought about the cattle losses, 28 head over 8 weeks. She thought about the fence line, clean cuts, professional work. She thought about a man who controlled the town's water supply and who had a lawyer on retainer, and who walked down sidewalks as if gravity was one of his subordinates. She thought about patience, about the difference between reacting and responding. She climbed up onto the buckboard. Ezra climbed up on his side. He picked up the reins. The horses leaned forward and the buckboard began to move. They were past the feed store and heading toward the edge of town when he said, without turning his head, "You know he's going to come back at this differently." "Yes. Harder. Probably." She looked at the road ahead. "Men like that don't accept a setback as a setback. They accept it as information." She paused. "He'll try to understand what I know, how I know it, whether I'm an obstacle or a resource." "Which is it?" She considered it honestly. "Depends on whether he thinks he can use me," she said. "He'll try that first. A man like Pike doesn't start with force when charm is available." She pulled her collar up against the wind as they left the shelter of the buildings and hit the open road. "We need to be careful with the water spring documentation. If he's looking for grounds to claim rights over the spring, he'll try to find any gap in the legal record. The spring's been on Broken Elbow land since the original land grant. Then the original land grant needs to be on paper, legible, filed correctly, and not 6 years away from being challenged on a technicality." She looked at him. "Do you have a copy of the original grant?" A brief pause in the desk. "I'll look at it tonight." He nodded. One nod. Then the road took them into the sage flats, and the mountains came back into view ahead, and the town fell away behind them, getting small. She was quiet for a mile or so, watching the country, thinking. They think you. Why? She said. It came out plainly, because she'd been sitting with it since the mercantile, and she was not a person who benefited from sitting with things too long without saying them. He glanced at her. Back to the road. I know what they think. Does it bother you? He thought about that for a moment. Not the quick denial she might have gotten from a man who wanted to appear a certain way. A genuine pause. I know the truth of it, he said. That's enough for me. Another pause. Does it bother you? She thought about the women in the mercantile, the sideways looks, the word, bought, said in that particular register, that managed to be both accurate on its surface and completely wrong underneath. It bothers me that they think my being here require an explanation, she said. That a woman coming to the frontier to work is, she looked for the word, implausible. Unless there's a transaction, unless someone's managing her. She watched a hawk riding a thermal far overhead. In Philadelphia, there were different names for the same thing. But the principle was the same, that someone owns you, that someone has to have arranged you. She pulled her coat tighter. Otherwise, why would you be here? He was quiet for a while. You came here yourself, he said. Answered an advertisement. He kept his eyes on the road. That's an arrangement with yourself. She looked at him. He said it so matter-of-factly, the way he said everything. Not as a comfort, not as a reassurance, just as an accurate description of what had occurred. She looked back at the road. Yes, she said. That's what it is. The sage flats opened up around them, and the creek appeared to the north, a dark line through the frost-pale grass. And the peaks ahead were catching the noon sun on their snowfields and throwing it back in long white flashes. She sat with what she felt. The anger about the mercantile was real, and she let it be real without trying to convert it into something more manageable. The thing, Ezra's 4 plain words had produced in her chest, the weight of being seen accurately by someone who wasn't trying to get anything from it. She let that be real, too, both things at once. You could do that. She was finding that you could hold more things simultaneously in Wyoming than she'd been permitted to in Philadelphia, where every feeling had a prescribed container and a prescribed duration, and anything that didn't fit was to be suppressed until it died or broke something. She looked at his profile, the jaw, the Stetson's brim, the weathered coat, the hands on the reins easy, competent, giving the horses exactly what they needed, and nothing extra. She had been in this territory for 6 weeks. She'd been told, explicitly and implicitly, in a dozen different ways, that she was out of place here. Too soft, too educated, too Eastern, too female, too complicated for a frontier that valued simplicity and toughness above most things. She'd burned her hand on a skillet. She'd fallen off a horse. She'd set her shoulder against a cave wall in a blizzard and let a man hurt her arm to fix it. She'd read the definitions section. She was not out of place. She was in a different place than she'd expected, learning different things than she'd expected, and finding to her genuine surprise that the learning was not a burden, that there was something in the specific difficulty of this life, the absolute requirement that you be competent or, visibly, and immediately, that she found clarifying. In Philadelphia, she'd been smart in a room where being smart was a problem to be managed. Out here, being smart had saved Ezra Vance a water spring. That was a different equation. She liked it considerably better. They rode through the afternoon, and the ranch came into view ahead, and the smoke from the chimney told her the banked fire had held, and Sergeant came out of the barn to meet them and immediately pressed his enormous head against Ezra's knee when he climbed down. She climbed down herself. She took the box of dried goods from the back of the buckboard and carried it up the porch steps. She held the door with her shoulder and brought it inside and set it on the larder shelf. She went back for the next box. Ezra was unhitching the horses. He would take them around to the barn, brush them down, give them water, and feed. She knew his sequence now. the order in which he did the end-of-day chores, the way the ranch tasks arranged themselves into a pattern she'd come to recognize the shape of. She brought the last box in. She started the stove properly, the damper and the draft in the right positions, the tinder catching on the second strike now instead of the fifth. She put water on to boil. She got the beans from the larder and set them soaking for tomorrow. She went to the desk and opened the bottom drawer where he kept the important papers. The land grant was there. She unfolded it carefully on the desk and sat down and read it under the lamp. It was dated 1868. The language was the formal federal language of territorial land, grants dense and specific, which was good. The boundaries were described by metes and bounds, which was the standard of the time, and she read them carefully, looking for the spring. It was there, described as the natural spring, arising at approximately the northeast corner of the designated parcel, and all water rights pertaining thereto. Clear, unambiguous, properly recorded. She sat back. She reached for the separate ledger she'd started for the cattle losses and turned to a new page. At the top she wrote, in her clean architectural hand, water rights documentation. She copied the relevant language from the land grant. She noted the grant date, the filing information, the county record number. Then she added a note at the bottom, recommend filing a confirmatory survey with the Territorial Land Office before spring. Cost estimated $12.18. Purpose to create a current, unimpeachable record of the spring's location and ownership prior to any challenge. Prevents the kind of procedural attack that relies on aging documentation. She looked at the note. She thought about Pike's face when she'd folded the document and handed it back to him. The small, controlled adjustment of his smile. She was going to write that letter to the Territorial Land Office tomorrow. She was going to have it ready for Ezra to sign by the time he came in for breakfast. She opened the main ledger. She entered today's supply purchases in the correct columns. She cross-referenced the lander flour arrangement. She balanced the week. The fire had caught properly and the water was coming to a boil. The cabin was warm. She heard the barn door, boots on the porch. The door opened. Ezra came in, hung his coat, went to the stove. He looked in the pot. Beans are soaking, she said with that, out looking up from the ledger. For tomorrow, there's salt pork for tonight if you start it. He said nothing. He got the salt pork from the larder. She heard the skillet go onto the stove. She wrote up the note on the Water Spring survey. She wrote the draft letter to the Territorial Land Office. He cooked. She worked. The fire did its work and the cabin held its warmth. And outside, the sun went down behind the mountains, and the temperature fell fast and clean and serious in the way it did out here. Later, over the salt pork and beans, she pushed the draft letter across the table. He read it. He read the note about the survey. He looked at the cost estimate. He looked at the timeline she'd recommended. He put it down and cut a piece of salt pork. You wrote this today, he said, at the desk, while you were in the barn. She ate a spoonful of beans. The land grant language is clear, but clear language in an aging document is still an aging document. We need a current survey on record before he finds a reason to need one. Ezra looked at the letter again. $12, he said, to 17, depending on travel time for the surveyor. She met his eyes. It's cheaper than losing the spring. He looked at the fire, at the letter, back at his plate. Send it, he said. She nodded. Sergeant moved in front of the fire and settled with his heavy grunt of satisfaction. She reached for the salt. Outside, the wind began its long work on the cabin walls, testing them, finding them solid. The fire answered every time. The lamp burned steady. She thought about Pike's flat gray eyes, about the filing information for the land grant, memorized now, about the definition section of a document most men would have signed without reading. She thought about patience, about the difference between a man who arrived at an encounter with a document already prepared and a woman who arrived having already read 6 weeks of history in a ledger. She thought about who was better prepared for what was coming. She passed the cornbread. Ezra took a piece. They ate in the warm cabin, while the mountains held the dark at their edges, and the creek moved north and everything was quiet and serious and real. November came in without ceremony. The land grant survey letter had gone out on a Tuesday. By the following Monday, Corinne had received a confirmation from the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. A clerk's notation on the bottom of her own letter returned with an official stamp and a scheduled date in early December. She pinned it to the inside cover of the water rights ledger and felt something settle in her chest. That was close to satisfaction, but harder than that, more like readiness. She'd been feeling it for weeks. The readiness. A sharpening of attention that she recognized from the months before she'd left Philadelphia. That particular alertness that came when you understood something was coming and you couldn't stop it, but you could be prepared for it when it arrived. Ezra felt it too. She could tell by the way he'd changed his routine. He was up earlier. He checked the fence lines more often, not in the anxious way of a man expecting to find something, but in the disciplined way of a man who understood that, knowing the status of things, was the only real protection against being surprised by them. He'd also quietly said something to the neighboring homesteaders, a family named Aldrich to the east, and a pair of bachelor brothers named Foss, who ran cattle on the North Range. She'd seen the conversations happen from a distance without being told about them, and she understood what they were without needing an explanation. He was building something, not defensively, practically. She'd started doing the same in her own sphere. She wrote up the cattle loss documentation in a form that could be submitted to the county sheriff as an official complaint with dates, pasture locations, estimated values, and the fence evidence organized into a clear sequence. She had it ready, but didn't send it yet. Timing mattered. And an unsubstantiated complaint filed too early was just a document that could be dismissed. Evidence needed context. Context needed time. She was learning patience out here in a new way. In Philadelphia, patience had meant endurance surviving time that was being used against you. Out here it meant something more active. It meant building, preparing, watching, letting the land and the situation tell you what was coming before it arrived so you were already standing in the right place when it did. She still wasn't good at the cold. She accepted this about herself. In the mornings, when she came out of her room and crossed the cabin to the stove, the air inside was cold enough to make her eyes water until she had the fire going properly. She wore 2 wool layers under her dress now and had taken to leaving the sheepskin coat Ezra's spare one, handed to her, without comment in the 3rd week, hanging on the peg nearest her door. She could build a fire in under 4 minutes now. She'd timed herself. She'd also, in the past week, made decent biscuits. Not perfect, but decent risen properly, not chalk inside, edible without requiring a description of what they were supposed to taste like. She'd made them twice now, and the second batch was better than the first, which was the pattern with everything out here. The repetition was the point. On the 3rd evening of November, she was at the desk finishing the month's ledger entries when Ezra came in from the barn fast. Not running, he never ran, but moving with a tightened efficiency that she'd come to read the way she read everything else about him. She looked up. "Storm coming," he said. He went straight to the window and looked north. "Big one. Sky's wrong." She came to stand beside him. The sky to the north and west had gone the color she'd seen once before in October, right before the blizzard that had put her in a cave on the ridge, but larger. The October sky had been a bruise. This was something with more intention behind it, a wall of dark moving fast, already eating the lower peaks. "How long?" she said. "Maybe 4 hours, maybe less." He turned from the window. "I need to bring the cattle in from the south pasture and get them into the lower barn. The horses need extra feed and water. If that hits hard, I won't be able to get out to them until it passes." He was already moving to the door, already in his coat. "Fill the water barrel on the porch and bring the wood in. All of it, stack it inside. and bank the stove so it's holding slow. She was already moving. She had her coat on before he finished the sentence. How much wood? She said. 3 days' worth. Maybe 4. He looked at her. And stay inside once it starts. Whatever you hear, whatever happens, you stay inside. She met his eyes. Understood. He went out. She worked fast. The wood was stacked on the side of the barn, a 4-month supply they'd built over October, her and Ezra, splitting and stacking until her hands had calluses she'd never anticipated having. She loaded her arms and carried it to the porch, stacking it against the cabin wall, inside the overhang, then inside, against the interior wall, then more. Her shoulder ached in the cold. She kept going. The water barrel was nearly full already. She kept it that way. She stopped it and brought the bucket inside. She banked the stove the way he'd shown her, damped it down to a slow, steady burn that would hold heat without going hungry for hours. She put on the largest pot they had and filled it with water to keep near. The stove-hot water was useful in ways you didn't predict. She looked at the window. The sky had darkened further in the 30 minutes since Ezra had come in. The wind had picked up, and it had that voice, the particular low roar she'd heard once before from inside a cave, now coming from outside the cabin and getting louder. She brought in the last of the wood. She latched the shutters on the 2 windows. She checked that the root cellar trapdoor behind the stove was secured. She went to the desk and put the open ledgers away. She wasn't sure why she did that. Some instinct about protecting records. She put the water rights ledger and the cattle loss documentation in the trunk in her room, under the clothes. Then she lit the lamps, both of them, the big one on the table and the smaller one on the shelf, and she sat down and waited. The wind arrived first. It came from the northwest in a sustained, continuous assault that had no peak and no pause, just permanent intensity, a sound like pressure rather than movement. The cabin walls did their job. The logs were solid, chinked well, and the fire breathed steadily. But the windows rattled. The door shifted in its frame. Then the snow. She heard it before she saw it through the shutters. A hiss against the wood that built to something harder, granular almost, driven at speed. Not the soft, heavy snow of October. This was mean snow, cold and fast and horizontal. She sat by the fire with the Montaigne and read and did not allow herself to watch the door. An hour passed, maybe more. She heard cattle, distant, agitated, the particular complaint of animals that were cold and objecting to it. Then the sound faded. Ezra had gotten them in. She let out a breath she'd been holding in her shoulders. Another 30 minutes. The storm was full now, complete, a single enormous fact pressing against every surface of the cabin at once. The fire popped. The lamp flames bent slightly and then steadied. The door opened. Ezra came in on a wave of cold air and snow. He was white with it, coat, hat, the shoulders and arms of him all covered, his beard collecting flakes that hadn't melted yet from the sheer cold. He pushed the door shut behind him and stood in it for a moment. She got up and put the coffee pot on the stove. He took off the outer coat and shook it at the door, then hung it. He pulled off his hat and set it on the table. He sat down in the chair by the fire and held his hands toward the heat. Cattle are in, he said. Horses are settled, I know. I heard the cattle go quiet. He looked at her briefly. You stayed inside. You told me to stay inside. I did. She poured the coffee when it was hot and set it in front of him. He wrapped both hands around the tin cup and said nothing for a while. She sat across from him and pulled the Montaigne back into her lap, though she wasn't really reading it. Outside, the storm made its sound. Inside, the fire answered. The cabin felt very specifically itself, in that moment solid and warm and deliberate, a thing built against exactly this. She looked at him over the top of the book. He was staring at the fire, not with any particular expression on his face, just the neutral watchfulness he wore when he was thinking. His coffee steamed. His hands were warming. He'd gotten the cattle in, and the horses settled in the middle of what was becoming a serious blizzard. Alone, in the dark, and he was sitting there as if he'd done nothing more notable than fix a fence post. She thought about that. She thought about what it cost a person to do hard things quietly, not because they couldn't be acknowledged, because the doing of them was simply the next task, and the task required all of you, and there was nothing left for drama. She'd spent her life in rooms where people performed their virtue loudly, where charity was announced before it was given and sacrifice was described in detail to ensure proper credit. Ezra had stood in front of a grizzly bear without calculating it and had set her shoulder and kept watch all night in a cave, and now had gone out into a blizzard to put cattle in a barn, and he would not mention any of it unless she asked, and sometimes not even then. She was finding that quality more disorienting than she'd expected. In a good way. In a way she didn't entirely have language for yet. The survey. Confirmation came back Monday, she said. I didn't tell you. The land office has us scheduled for early December. Good. He drank the coffee. Good timing. Both winter locks the passes. That's what I thought. The wind gusted and the door rattled once in its frame. Ezra glanced at it. It settled. He looked back at the fire. Corinne, he said. She looked up. The Foss brothers mentioned something last week. When I rode out to talk to them, he paused in his particular way. Not hesitation, just the space before a considered sentence. Pike's been making offers to the homesteaders along the North Range. Not aggressive yet. Friendly offers. Good prices on the surface. And below the surface? Foss said the payment terms have a clause they couldn't parse. They brought me the paper. He looked at her. I didn't have it in front of me when you said that about definition sections, but I thought about it. She sat forward. Do you still have the paper? Coat pocket. He reached into the hanging coat and produced a folded document. He put it on the table. She went to the table and opened it and read it under the lamp. It took her less time to find it this time. She knew what she was looking for. Knew Pike's lawyer's habits now, the preference for cross-reference clauses. The definitions section placed at the back to discourage casual readers. This one was different in method, but identical in intent. A land purchase agreement with a financing component. The Foss brothers would receive payment in installments. The final installment was contingent on a clear title verification completed by a surveyor named in the agreement, a specific surveyor, by name. A surveyor she'd never heard of, which meant nothing on its own. But a surveyor named in a contract was a surveyor whose findings served the person who named him. He's systematically building a position, she said. She stood at the table and looked at the document and thought it through in sequence. The cattle rustling. Compromises ranch finances across the valley. Weakened ranchers are more likely to accept an offer. The offer comes with terms that give him legal grounds to dispute the title later. A surveyor he controls, a payment contingency he can manufacture a reason to withhold. She looked at Ezra. He's not trying to buy the valley. He's trying to create a series of legal vulnerabilities that let him take it. Ezra was watching her from the chair. What do we do about it? First, the Foss brothers don't sign this. I'll write them a letter explaining the specific clause that concerns me. She was already thinking through the sequence. Second, if there are other homesteaders who've received similar offers, we need to know. A pattern of predatory contracts is something the territorial court can act on. One document is an aggressive business practice. 5 is a pattern of fraud. How do you prove the surveyor is compromised? You may not be able to directly, but you don't have to. She folded the document and kept it. If he's used this surveyor before, there'll be records at the county land office of disputes or irregularities in surveys he's conducted. I'll request those records. She looked at him. It'll take time. How much time? Weeks. Possibly through winter. She sat back down. This isn't a fast problem. He's been building it for a long time. We dismantle it in pieces. He was quiet for a moment. You're not afraid of him, he said. She considered that honestly. I'm careful of him, she said. That's more useful than fear. She picked up her coffee cup, found it cold, set it back down. I grew up around men like Pike. They have different resources, different suits, different offices, but the operating principle is the same. They mistake people's patience for weakness. They mistake legal language for reality. She looked at the fire. The document he gave you in town assumed you wouldn't read the definitions section. My existence is inconvenient to that assumption. He said nothing, but he was looking at her with that expression she'd learned to recognize. The quiet recalibration. You could sleep, she said. You've been out in that since dusk. I'll sleep when the storm peaks. He looked toward the door. Right now, it's still building. She didn't argue. She picked up the Foss brothers document and went back to the desk to start the letter. She worked for an hour. The storm worked outside. He sat by the fire, and she sat at the desk, and the cabin held everything it was supposed to hold, and the lamp burned steady, and the fire breathed slow. And that was the evening of the third day of November. She went to bed around midnight and slept well, which surprised her less than it would have 6 weeks ago. The storm ran its course over 2 days. Hard days cold beyond what she'd experienced in October. The snow piling against the shuttered windows until the light through the cracks in the wood was a blue-gray version of daylight. Ezra went out twice, briefly, for the cattle and horses. She made the food. She finished the letter to the Foss brothers. She worked through the December supply projections and found 2 more places where buying in bulk before hard winter locked the roads would save the ranch money. On the third morning, the wind stopped, just stopped. One moment, that perpetual pressure, and the next, a silence so complete she thought for a second she'd gone deaf. She lay in bed and listened to it, the silence after a storm that had been going for 48 hours. And it was the most specific silence she'd ever heard. She got up and dressed and went to the stove and had the coffee. Going before Ezra's boots came down on the porch boards, the world outside was white in a way that was something past description. Not peaceful, not soft. A kind of brutal, magnificent blankness, everything under the same thick blanket. The fences and the corrals and the distant tree line, all reduced to shapes under white. The sky above it was an absolute blue. She stood in the doorway with the coffee and looked at it. 2.5 feet, Ezra said from behind her. He was looking past her at the snow, maybe more at the drifts. Can you get the cattle out? Not yet. 2, 3 days. Once it settles and the crust forms, they can move on top of it. He took the coffee she held back without looking. Fences need to be checked before then. I'll go with you. He paused. Shoulder is fine. He looked at her. She held the look. All right, he said. They went out after breakfast and walked the south fence line and the east fence in the snow. It was hard walking, sometimes knee-deep in the drifts, the surface unpredictable, places where you thought it was solid and found it wasn't. She fell once. She got up. She kept going. 2 fence posts had come down under the snow weight. They reset them. Ezra drove the posts. She held the wire and worked the staples with her good hand. Her fingers went numb inside the gloves, and she kept working. It was physical in a way she could not have imagined in September. Not bad physical. The specific, demanding, honest physical of a body, doing a real thing in real conditions and managing it. Each post set was a fact. The wire held or it didn't. You could see what you'd done. She understood, walking back through the snow in the late afternoon light, why Ezra moved the way he did, why nothing he did was performed. Out here, performance was weight you carried, for no reason. The land and the weather were honest about what they were doing to you. You were honest back, or you wasted the energy. The evening of the 4th day after the storm, she was finishing the November ledger when Sargent started barking. Not the bark he used for Ezra, not the greeting bark for the Foss brothers when they'd ridden by. This was different, sustained, directed. The bark of a dog who detected something he decided was a problem. She was at the desk. Ezra was in the barn. She got up and went to the window and looked through the shutter slats. The darkness outside was total. No moon yet, and the snow threw back what little starlight existed in a dim, flat reflection. She couldn't see much. The barn, the corrals, the track of the road, disappearing into the dark. Then she saw the light, not the lamplight of a rider. Something larger. Something orange. On the wrong side of the barn, she got to the door. The supply barn was on fire. Not small. Already not small. The flames had found the hay, and the hay had found the dry timber, and it was going with the committed efficiency of a fire that had been burning longer than she'd been watching the window. The north wall was fully involved. The roof was beginning to catch. Ezra was already out of the main barn, running, not toward the fire but around it, reading it, understanding the wind direction, and what it meant for the main barn and the cabin. She came down the porch steps. "Get the animals out of the main barn," he called. She went. She didn't think about the fire, or the heat, or the orange light painting everything in moving shadows. She went to the main barn and worked the latch and got inside. The horses were agitated. Calhoun was kicking the boards of his stall, and Prudence was turning in tight circles. She got Calhoun first because he was the bigger problem, got the lead rope on him, and talked low and moved him out. He didn't want to go anywhere near the fire, and she didn't blame him, and she used that turned him away from it, kept herself between him and the orange light, walked him fast to the far corral, and got him through the gate. She went back for Prudence. She was tying the second lead rope when she heard it. Voices. Not Ezra's. Multiple. Outside. She stopped. Male voices. Not shouting. Speaking in the deliberate way of men who were coordinating. She heard boots in the snow. More than one set. More than two. She led Prudence out, and her eyes adjusted, and she counted. 4 men in the yard, coming from the south. Not ranch hands. The way they moved was wrong for ranch hands. They had something purposeful about them, something organized, and 2 of them were carrying rifles that were not being carried casually. A wagon behind them. 2 more men on the wagon seat, and behind the wagon, barely visible in the firelight, a figure she recognized. The Philadelphia suit had been replaced with a traveling coat, but the bearing was unmistakable. The way he stood like gravity owed him something. Her former fiancé. She led Prudence past the corral gate and stood in the snow and looked at him, and the specific cold feeling that moved through her then was not surprise. It was the feeling of a thing you've been waiting for that has finally arrived, and the waiting is over, and now you have to decide in the next 30 seconds what you are going to do. One of the men near the wagon held up a document. "Ezra Vance," he called. His voice was flat and professional. "We have a warrant for the arrest of Corinne LeClaire, charged under Pennsylvania law with grand larceny and attempted murder." Ezra was at the far side of the supply barn, visible in the firelight, watching the men. He was very still. She knew what grand larceny meant in this context. She knew it as the legal dressing on the fact of her having taken the jewelry her mother had left her jewelry that had been converted, in Philadelphia's legal accounting, into her fiancé's property the moment the marriage contract was drawn. She knew what attempted murder meant. She'd overturned a decanter of wine on him during one of his more specific demonstrations of what their marriage would be, and one of his lawyers had apparently decided that was useful. Charges filed by powerful men with patient lawyers and a long reach. She looked at Ezra across the yard. He was looking at her. One moment brief, direct. She didn't know what she communicated in that moment, or what he received, but something passed between them in the firelight, in the noise and the cold, and then he moved. "This is Wyoming territory," he said. He walked toward the men with his hands loose at his sides. "A Pennsylvania warrant has no authority here. We're Pinkerton agents," the man with the document said. "Operating under, I know what Pinkertons are." Ezra had stopped about 15 feet from the men. "I also know federal jurisdiction doesn't cover private domestic disputes dressed up as criminal matters. You want her extradited. You go through the territorial court." He looked at the man with the document and then past him. And he looked at the figure behind the wagon. "Don't have the right to step foot on my property." Her fiancé came forward. He looked older than she remembered, or maybe just harder. The trip had done something to the polish. He looked at her across the yard. "Corinne." His voice had the particular quality she remembered, the one that sounded like reason and wasn't. She said nothing. "This doesn't have to be unpleasant," he said. "Come back with us voluntarily, and I'll have the charges reduced." "The charges," she said, "are fabricated. The charges are documented." He gestured to the man with the warrant. "Come voluntarily, or come in irons. Either way, you're coming." Ezra took one more step forward. "She's not going anywhere with you." The shot came from the side. The south, not from the men in the yard. She heard it, and simultaneously saw Ezra stagger, saw him hit from the left side of his chest, saw the momentum of it take him backward toward the bank of the frozen creek that ran along the south edge of the yard. She opened her mouth. She didn't know what sound came out. He went over the bank, just went over it, the snow and the ice and the momentum of the shot carrying him backward, and over the edge in a single terrible sequence. And then he was gone. Below the bank was the creek, half frozen, the current running black beneath the ice, and the night swallowed him completely. 2 seconds of absolute silence. Then everything happened at once. The men moved toward her. Prudence bolted into the dark. Sergeant was barking somewhere she couldn't see. The supply barn roared on the other side of the yard, throwing orange light over everything, and the shadows moved in every direction, and she was still looking at the place where the bank ended and the dark began. "Ezra," she said at once. Not loud, not screaming, just said it. The way you said a word when the thing it described was gone, and you were still trying to make it exist. Then hands on her arms. The cold of the iron before she fully registered it, her wrists being pulled behind her, the snap of the restraints. She fought. She fought hard. She got one arm free and got someone's wrist and bit down, and the man swore and hit her. And she went to her knees in the snow and was back up before the next breath, because going to her knees was not a choice she was willing to make. They got the chains on her. She was pulled toward the wagon. She kept looking at the bank of the creek, at the dark below it, at the snow where his boots had last been. There was nothing, just the dark creek bank and the snow and the orange fire and the cold. They put her in the wagon. The men organized themselves. Her fiancé stood near the wagon and looked at her with an expression she'd seen on him twice before. The specific satisfaction of a man who has ended an inconvenient complication and can now move on to the next thing. She looked at the creek bank, his blood on the snow. A dark stain, small but undeniable, where he'd gone over the edge, and above it, caught on a fence post nail, where it must have snagged when he fell, his red neckerchief. It lifted in the cold wind and turned and lifted again, and the firelight caught it. She watched it as the wagon began to move. She kept watching it as the yard shrank behind them, and the fire sent its light across the snow, and the darkness swallowed the ranch and the creek bank and the neckerchief that turned and turned in the wind above the ice-black current. Then it was all dark, just snow and night, and the wagon moving east toward the road, and the cold, and the chains on her wrists, and her own breathing deliberate and controlled, and the only thing she still commanded. She did not cry. She looked at the darkness where the ranch had been, and she breathed, and she thought, in the careful, methodical part of her mind that kept working, no matter what her body was doing, that she did not believe he was dead. She didn't know why she believed that. There was no evidence for it. The shot had been close, and the bank was high, and the creek was running, and the temperature had been below freezing for 4 days. She believed it the way she believed numbers in a ledger, because the account didn't balance without him. Because the story she was inside did not add up to that ending. Because Ezra Vance had stood in front of a grizzly bear and kept watch all night in a cave and reset a dislocated shoulder in a blizzard. And she was not ready to accept that a bullet and a frozen creek were a sufficient conclusion to a man like that. She breathed. She sat in the wagon and looked at the black sky and breathed. The wagon went east through the dark and the snow and the cold, and behind them the fire burned itself down to embers, and the creek ran under its ice in the dark, And somewhere in the valley an owl called once and was answered by nothing. She would need to be precise when they arrived, wherever they were taking her. She would need to be careful. She would need to think, she breathed in. 4 counts. Out. 4 counts. She had a 3-month contract in a cabin that was still standing. She had a land grant with a confirmed survey appointment in December. She had 17 weeks of ledgers that documented everything. The cattle losses, the fence cuts, the water rights, the Foss brothers' contract, all of it organized and filed in the trunk in her room, under her clothes, where no one would look. Records. Real records. Signed, dated, methodical. She had learned from a man who understood that the best protection against being rewritten was having already written it down first. She sat in the chains in the dark, in the cold, and she breathed, and she thought about what came next. And she did not look back again, because looking back was not useful, and she was, at her most fundamental, a useful person. The wagon moved east. Behind her, on a fence post nail above the frozen creek, a red neckerchief turned slowly in the wind and said nothing to the dark. The cold that came off the river was its own kind of living thing. It moved up through the snow and the dark and found every gap in clothing, every place where skin was exposed. It was the cold of water that had never been warm, water that ran under ice for months, and remembered the ice even in the places where it ran free. Ezra Vance lay face down in the shallows of the Wind River and felt all of it. The bullet had taken him on the left side, high and lateral, and the fall had finished what the bullet started. He knew the inventory of his body the way a soldier learns to know it, not by thinking about it, but by what it would and wouldn't do. The chest moved, the lungs worked. He could feel the cold, which meant the nerves were working. None of that was enough to tell him he was fine, but all of it was enough to tell him he was alive, and alive was the relevant fact. He turned his face out of the water. The river here was shallow enough that he hadn't gone under fully. The current had pulled him 20 yards downstream from where he'd gone over the bank, and deposited him in an eddy where a fallen cottonwood had changed the water's direction. The ice along the edges was thick. The water itself was black and moving, and very serious about what it was doing. He got his hands under him. The left side didn't cooperate well. He worked around it, using his right arm to push, getting his knees under him in the shallows. The cold had done something useful, numbed the wound enough that the pain was more information than sensation. That wouldn't last. He knew that from experience he'd never wanted to accumulate. He got upright. He stood in the shallow water of the Wind River in the dark, and he breathed and he listened. The ranch was behind him and upriver. He could see the fire, or what was left of it, throwing a dim orange smear across the low clouds to the north. The supply barn. He'd understood what that was from the first smell of the smoke before the men had appeared in the yard. A distraction built to create chaos, to pull attention and divide response. Pike's work, or the work of men who thought like Pike. The other smell, the colder smell, underneath the smoke, was the smell of something he hadn't identified in the yard, and was identifying now. The specific combination of horse lather and trail dust, and a particular kind of machine oil that men carried when they traveled with maintained firearms over long distances. That smell didn't belong to Pike's local hired hands. It was Eastern. Professional, Pinkerton. He'd worked alongside Pinkerton agents twice during the war. Both times in contexts he didn't think about if he could avoid it. He knew what they were and what they did, and how they thought about the difference between legal and convenient. He climbed out of the river. Getting up the bank was the hardest part. His left arm wasn't reliable, and the bank was steep, and the cold had done interesting things to his coordination. He found handholds in the roots of the cottonwood and went up slowly, methodically, the way you did, when speed wasn't available, and steady was the only option. He made it. He lay on the snow at the top of the bank for a moment, breathing, then got to his feet. The wagon tracks were clear in the snow. Even in the dark, even with only the diffuse light of the dying fire, The tracks of a heavy loaded wagon were readable deep parallel lines heading east toward the main road. Multiple sets of boot prints alongside them. The wagon had stopped near where he'd fallen and then moved on, which meant they thought he was dead or didn't care, and either way they hadn't bothered to confirm it. That was a mistake. He was 200 yards from the main barn. He went there first. Calhoun was in the far corral. Corinne had gotten him out. He could see the tracks, and he felt something move through his chest that had nothing to do with the bullet. She'd gotten the horses out in the middle of all of it. Of course she had. He got the saddle on Calhoun, with his right arm doing most of the work, and Calhoun standing unusually still, as if the horse understood that this was not a moment for opinions. He got the Winchester from the tack room. He checked it. He got up on the horse. He rode east. He didn't ride fast. Fast would get him found and exhausted and dead in the snow, which helped no one. He rode with purpose and attention, staying off the main track, following it by sight from the tree line. The wagon was heavy, and moving at a pace set by the draft horses, not by urgency. They thought they had time. They thought they had a dead man behind them and clear road ahead. He'd ridden about 3 miles when he heard the horses, not the wagon. Horses coming from the south through the timber at a pace that was careful rather than hurried 3 of them. He pulled Calhoun off the track and into the shadow of a stand of firs and waited. They came out of the trees into the open ground. Along the track, 3 riders on horses that moved with a particular sure-footed quiet of animals that knew this country. He recognized the horses before he recognized the riders, because the horses were ones he'd seen before. A gray mare with a distinctive white marking along the jaw. A small brown gelding, a taller bay. He'd traded for 2 of those horses. He knew who rode them. He came out of the shadow. The lead rider pulled up. A man of about 50, heavyset in a buffalo robe, with a face that had spent so many decades outside that it had arrived at something past weathered, something that was simply its own weather. He looked at Ezra on the roan. He looked at the blood on Ezra's coat. He made a sound that in English would have been a low, dry exhalation of unsurprised recognitions. He said, "Running Bear." Ezra looked at the 3 of them. "You're out late. We saw the fire." Running Bear's English was deliberate and precise, learned over years, and maintained carefully. He was a man who said things because he meant them, which Ezra had always appreciated. "We were coming to see." "They took someone," Ezra said. "A woman, wagon, 6 men, heading east on the main road. Hour ahead of me, maybe less." Running Bear looked at the road, at the tracks. He said something to the man on his left in Shoshone that Ezra caught most of but not all of, and the man on the left nodded and moved his horse. "You are shot," Running Bear said to Ezra. "I know. This is a fact that matters. It matters less than the wagon." Running Bear looked at him for a long moment. They had a history that didn't fit neatly into any single description, not friendship exactly, not alliance, something older and more practical than either of those words. Years of shared boundary lines and honest dealing, and the specific kind of trust that developed between men who had both, at various points, had reason to be suspicious of each other and chosen not to be. "You will ride with us," Running Bear said. It was not a question. "Yes," Ezra said. They rode east. Running Bear had 2 of his men ride ahead to track the wagon, staying in the timber along the road's south side where the shadows were heaviest. He rode with Ezra and said nothing for the first mile, which Ezra understood as a form of respect the man was letting him keep his focus, not filling the cold air with words that weren't needed. At the 2nd mile, Running Bear produced a length of cloth from inside his robe and handed it across without ceremony. Ezra took it. He packed it against the wound, as well as he could one-handed on a moving horse. The bleeding had slowed, the cold had helped with that, and the bullet had gone through cleanly, which he'd determined by the time he'd reached the barn. Through and through, missing the lung, catching the muscle at the edge of the chest wall. It would be a serious problem in a few hours. Right now, it was a manageable problem, and manageable was enough. The woman, Running Bear said. She is important to you. Ezra looked at the road ahead. She is. I have heard this in how you speak of the ranch. In the past months, Running Bear paused. A man's voice changes when something has come into his life that he did not expect. Ezra said nothing. This is not a criticism, Running Bear said. I know, Ezra said. They rode another half-mile in quiet. The scouts came back out of the timber ahead one of them. The younger man pulling his horse alongside Running Bear's and speaking quickly in Shoshone. Ezra caught enough. The wagon had stopped. A building. Not Willow Creek, east of Willow Creek, closer to the county line. A relay station that Pike had used before for things he didn't want done in town. He knew the building. He'd ridden past it twice. Low, long structure, originally built for the stage line and then sold when the route changed. It sat back from the road in a stand of cottonwoods along a dry creek bed, good sight lines in every direction, which was why the stage company had liked it and why someone with 6 armed men and a prisoner would stop there on a cold night rather than pushing on to the county seat. They needed to think they were safe. They needed the wagon horses rested before the next leg. They needed walls around them because the dark and the cold and the open Wyoming country made men who'd come from back east nervous in ways they didn't entirely admit to themselves. Ezra studied the ground they were covering. He was thinking in the way he'd learned to think in the war, not tactically, exactly, but spatially. The lay of the land. What you could see from where. What could be approached quietly, and what couldn't. His chest hurt in a steady, serious way that he filed as information and set aside. He laid it out for Running Bear in straightforward terms. Running Bear listened, asked 2 questions, and looked at his men. He rearranged them with a few words and a gesture. Then he looked at Ezra. The man who fired the shot, Running Bear said. In your yard. I don't know which man it was. What do you want to do with them? Ezra thought about that honestly for a moment. Get her out, he said. After that, they leave Wyoming. All of them. Running Bear nodded once. And the man from Philadelphia, he leaves too. Alive. Alive, Ezra said. A man like that, you kill him, and you make him a martyr for every judge and lawyer he knows back east. You let him walk away humiliated, and you've done more damage to him than a bullet would. Running Bear considered this. You have thought about this before tonight. I've thought about men like him for a long time. They moved into position in the timber around the relay station. The building had 2 windows on the south side, both lit. A guard at the front door, one man, stamping his feet against the cold, breath-making clouds in the lamplight that spilled under the doorframe. 2 horses at the hitching rail that weren't the wagon horses. The wagon itself was around the east side, the draft horses tied to a post. The guard at the door was the only one visible. That meant 5 men inside, plus the fiancé, plus Corinne. Ezra came at the building from the north, out of the timber, on foot. Calhoun he'd left with Running Bear's man. He moved in the snow the way he'd learned to move in the war, not slowly, but without waste. Each step considered, and placed, and quiet. The wound talked to him the whole way. He didn't answer it. He came around the east side of the building. The guard heard him when he was 6 feet away. Turned, opened his mouth. Ezra hit him once, cleanly, and caught him on the way down and set him against the wall of the building. He checked the man's pulse. Steady. He'd be cold and embarrassed when he woke up, but upright. He tried the east door. Unlocked. The relay station was built for travelers, not for defense. The lock on the main door was the social lock of a building that assumed good faith in its visitors, which was an assumption that had failed tonight. He went in. The east room was a storage area, crates, harness, the particular smell of a space that had been used by many people and belonged to none of them. A door on the west wall. Light under it. Voices low, male. The rumble of men talking about logistics, about roads, about how long the county seat was from here. He went to the door and listened. 4 men in the main room. He could count them by voice, two near the fire, one at the far window, one moving. The fourth voice was the Pinkerton who'd read the warrant. Professional flat, talking about the morning schedule. A fifth door on the north wall of the main room. No light under it. Separate room. She'd be there. He went through the door. 2 seconds of chaos. The man near the fire reached for his belt, and Running Bear's 2 men came through the front door, simultaneously with the noise Ezra made, and the 4 men in the room made the correct calculation about the odds very quickly. The reaching hand stopped. Nobody shot anybody, which was the desired outcome. The man by the window had both hands visible before Ezra asked for it. The Pinkerton, the one who'd read the warrant, looked at Ezra, with his professional assessment running behind his eyes. He looked at the blood on Ezra's coat. He looked at Running Bear's men. He looked at the Winchester. "You were shot," he said. "I've had worse," Ezra said. "The north room. Is she in there?" A pause. "She's unharmed." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. "Yes." Ezra kept his eyes on the room. He spoke over his shoulder to Running Bear's younger man, who went to the north door and knocked twice and said, "Through the wood, there is a man here named Vance. He asks if you are well." A silence that lasted about 3 seconds. Then her voice through the door, steady and clear and not at all broken. "Tell him yes. Tell him I'd like the door unlocked." The younger man looked at Ezra. "The key," Ezra said to the room. The Pinkerton reached slowly into his coat pocket and produced it. The door opened. She stood in the doorway of the north room in her wool coat, her wrists marked where the chains had been, her hair down from whatever arrangement it had been in, her dark eyes moving across the room in a single comprehensive sweep that catalogued everything. It contained the men, their positions, the weapons, Running Bear's men, Ezra. She looked at Ezra for a long moment. She looked at his coat, at the dark stain on the left side of it. Something moved across her face that she controlled almost immediately, but not before he saw it. She walked across the room to him. She stopped 2 feet away and looked up at him. "You went into the river," she said. "I came back out. You've been shot. I'm aware." She held his gaze. He could see her accounting for everything: the wound, the situation, what needed to happen next. The part of her that had read definition sections and organized ledgers and knew how to think while a fire was burning was already working. He could practically see the columns arranging themselves. "We need to deal with the wound," she said, "before we deal with anything else." "After," he said. "Ezra." "After," he said again. And the tone of it was the same tone he used when a fence needed to be repaired before the weather turned, and the discussion was already concluded. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she turned to face the room, which rearranged slightly at having her attention on it. Even now, even here, the door at the front of the station opened, and the last man came in, the one who'd been outside, Running Bear's man having collected him from where Ezra had left him against the wall. He was conscious and deeply unhappy. The fiancée was not in the room. Ezra saw the question form on Corinne's face and answered it before she asked. "South side. There was a horse at the south rail when we came in." Her expression went through something complicated. He ran, "Looks that way." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the Pinkerton. "Your warrant is invalid in this territory," she said. Her voice was conversational. "You know that. The charges it's based on are fabricated. The property in question was my mother's, left to me, converted without my consent or legal standing. You came here on the word of a man with enough money to make bad paper look like law." She paused. "That's going to be a problem for you when this reaches a territorial court. I have documentation of everything: the cattle rustling, the predatory land contracts, the arson tonight. All of it. Organized, dated, signed." She held the Pinkerton's professional gaze without blinking. "The question you need to answer tonight is whether your agency wants its name attached to this when that documentation reaches Cheyenne." The Pinkerton was quiet for a moment. "The warrant was presented to us as legitimate," he said. "I'm sure it was." She didn't say it with heat. She said it the way she said most things as an observation about the facts. Men like the one who hired you are very good at presenting things as legitimate. That's their primary skill. She looked at the warrant, which was on the table near the fire where someone had set it. Leave that. Leave the territory. Whatever he promised you, it isn't worth being named in what I'm filing in December. The Pinkerton looked at the warrant, at Ezra, at the room. He had the expression of a man recalculating something. The agency has no interest in territorial disputes, he said carefully. No, she agreed. I didn't think it would. They disarmed the men running Bear's people, were efficient about it, and made clear that the horses would be available in the morning, and the county line was a reasonable day's ride. The Pinkerton took his men and the wagon and the information he'd been given and made a decision that was both self-preserving and correct, which was, in Ezra's experience, the best kind of decision. They stood in the relay station after the men had gone, and the fire was burning low in the grate, and Running Bear's men were outside with the horses. Corinne looked at the door, at the space where the fiancé had not been. He'll try again, she said. Probably, Ezra said. We need the documentation filed before he does. Everything, the land grant survey, the cattle loss record, the Foss brothers contract. She turned from the door. I have all of it in the trunk, in the cabin. The cabin standing, he said. Supply barn went. Cabin standing. Something in her face shifted. I banked the stove before I went out for the wood, she said. She said it quietly, like she was telling him something she hadn't known. She was proud of until right now. I know, he said. She looked at him. Running Bear came through the front door. He looked at Ezra's coat with the directness of a man who had decided that enough time had been extended to necessary conversation, and the medical reality required attention now. Your woman is correct about the wound, he said to Ezra. This is not a thing that waits until morning. Corinne looked at Running Bear. Something passed between them, a mutual recognition, the acknowledgement of two people who had arrived at the same conclusion by different routes. Thank you, she said, for bringing him back. Running Bear considered her with the same directness he considered everything. He came back himself, he said. We followed. She looked at Ezra. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that the evening hadn't already said more clearly. She went to the supply shelf along the relay station wall and found what she was looking for, a kit that every stage relay station kept as a legal requirement for travelers in medical distress. She brought it to the table near the fire. Sit down, she said. Corinne? Ezra. She set the kit on the table and looked at him. Sit down. He sat. She worked with the same attention she brought to the ledgers. Methodical. Specific. She didn't talk while she worked, except to tell him what she was doing, and why, which he hadn't asked for, but which he found he didn't mind. Her hands were steady. She'd had practice, he thought, in staying steady while something hurt. Outside, the fire had burned itself down to a memory in the snow, and the wagon tracks went east into the dark, and somewhere on a fence post above the frozen creek, a red neckerchief had stopped turning. The cold was going out of the station now. The fire was built up. Running Bear sat near it in the way he sat near most things present, without demanding anything from the space. The spring survey is scheduled for December, Corinne said. She was wrapping the wound, her hands moving carefully. The appointment is confirmed. We'll need the documentation from the Foss brothers before then, the contract Pike gave them. I kept it. I know you did, Ezra said. She glanced at him. She was closer than she usually stood, necessity of the work, pulling the usual careful distance between them down to something else. He could see the marks on her wrists where the chains had been. He looked at them without saying anything. She caught where he was looking. I'm all right, she said. I know, he said. She finished the wrapping. She sat back and looked at her work with the same critical attention she gave the ledger columns, found it acceptable. She didn't move immediately. She sat there at the table across from him in the firelight, with the relay station quiet around them and Running Bear near the fire, and the horses outside in the cold. And she was thinking. He could tell. He'd learned to read it the particular quality of her stillness when she was assembling something. He's going to come back at this differently, she said. I know. He'll go back to Philadelphia and regroup. He'll find another legal angle. He'll work through Pike, probably, or someone like Pike. She looked at the table. We have a window. Between now and when he finds a new approach, we need everything filed, everything documented, everything in order. December, Ezra said. December, she agreed. She looked up at him then, not at the wound, not at the table. At him. You could have died tonight, she said. She said it without drama, stated it the way she stated facts. Didn't, he said. No. She held his gaze. You didn't, the fire breathed. Running Bear said something to his man near the door in Shoshone that was too quiet for Ezra to follow. Outside, one of the horses shifted its weight in the snow. We should get back, Ezra said. Sergeant will be worried. She looked at him for a moment. Then she stood and began putting the medical kit back in order, organizing the supplies, the way she organized everything, returning each thing to where it belonged, leaving the space better than she'd found it. Yes, she said. Let's go home. They rode back through the pre-dawn dark, Ezra and Corinne, and Running Bear's 3 men, through the snow and the cold and the enormous silence of the Wind River Valley at 4 in the morning. The clouds had broken. The stars were out in the particular density they got out here. More stars than sky, burning cold and close and indifferent to everything below them. The ranch came into view with the first gray of dawn. The cabin stood. The main barn stood. Where the supply barn had been there was a blackened rectangle in the snow, the walls mostly collapsed inward, still faintly smoking at the edges. But the cabin stood. The chimney was dark, the banked fire had held, but would need feeding now, and the windows were shuttered, and the porch was exactly where it had always been, and on the step sergeant sat with enormous dignity, watching their approach with an expression that managed to convey both profound relief and studied indifference to his own feelings. Corinne swung down from Prudence, who had, as predicted, gone straight home and walked up the porch steps and crouched down in the snow in front of the dog and put both hands on either side of his head and said something to him quietly that Ezra didn't catch. The dog pressed his forehead against hers. Running Bear stopped his horse beside Ezra's. He looked at the cabin. At the woman on the porch, he looked at Ezra. The valley will know what happened here, he said. By noon. I know, Ezra said. Pike will know. Good, Ezra said. Running Bear looked at him. Something in the older man's expression settled into the particular form of respect that didn't need to be announced. We will come for the spring survey, he said. When the time comes, as witnesses. Ezra looked at him. That's not a small thing to offer. No, Running Bear agreed. It is not. He held Ezra's gaze for a moment. Some things in this valley are worth the standing up for. He turned his horse, and the 3 riders went back south into the timber, quiet as they'd come. Ezra sat on Calhoun for a moment in the gray morning light. His chest was a serious problem that would need serious attention by a doctor within the next 2 days, and he knew it and was accounting for it. The supply barn was a total loss they'd need to rebuild before spring, which meant materials and labor, and a revision to the supply ledger he could already hear Corinne drafting in her head. He climbed down. His left side objected. He worked around it. He led Calhoun to the corral and saw to the horse with his right arm doing most of the work. He checked on the cattle in the lower barn. He checked on Prudence. He walked the yard once, reading the tracks in the snow who had stood where, the positions of the men, the place where the wagon had stopped. He found the place where he'd fallen. The bank was steep, 5 feet of near vertical drop to the river. In the snow at the top of the bank, before the edge, the tracks were clear boot prints, a dark stain already faded and half covered by the night's light snowfall, the place where momentum had carried him over. He stood there and looked at the river for a moment. It ran black and purposeful under its ice, indifferent to what had happened above it. In the dark, He looked at the fence post where his neckerchief had snagged. It was gone now, blown off in the night, or worked loose when the wind changed. He looked for it in the snow along the bank and found it about 20 feet downstream, half buried, the red cotton vivid against the white. He picked it up. He put it in his coat pocket. He went inside. The cabin was cold, but not deeply cold. The banked fire had done its job. Corinne had the stove open and was coaxing it back up from embers, the damper set correctly, the draft open to the right degree. She didn't look up when he came in. She was focused on the fire the way she focused on everything that needed doing completely, without distraction. The fire caught. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a moment. Then she stood and went to the coffee pot and filled it and set it on the burner that was already warming. She turned around. He was still standing near the door. She looked at him across the cabin, the coat, the left side, the gray morning coming through the cracks in the shutters. "Sit down," she said. He sat down. Outside, the sun was coming up behind the mountains, and the snow on the peaks caught it first, going from gray to white to a clean, sharp gold. The valley below held its silence, the way the valley always held it, not emptily, but with the fullness of a place that contained more than it showed. The coffee began to smell like coffee. Sargent came through his door in the wall and pressed his heavy head against Ezra's knee and stood there, breathing, offering what dogs offer, which is simply their presence, which is sometimes exactly the right thing. Ezra put his right hand on the dog's head. The fire burned. Corinne poured the coffee when it was ready and set it in front of him and sat down across the table. And outside the sun kept climbing, and the valley lay white and enormous, and entirely itself in the morning light. And the supply barn was gone and would be rebuilt, and the paperwork would be filed, and Pike would make his next move, and they would be ready for it. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. He wrapped his hand around his. "December," he said. He said, "December," she said. That was the whole conversation. It was enough. Out here, enough was its own kind of plenty. The doctor from Lander came on a Thursday and left on a Friday and said 3 things before he rode out. The bullet had missed everything vital by about 1.5 inches. The wound was clean. And if Ezra Vance got back on a horse before 2 weeks were up, he was a fool who deserved whatever happened to him next. Ezra was back on a horse in 10 days. Corinne noted this without comment. She'd learned that commenting on it fell into the same category as commenting on the weather. You could have an opinion, but the weather didn't care, and neither did he. What she did instead was make sure he ate, that the wound was dressed properly, morning and night, and that the ledgers were in order, because the ledgers were always the clearest picture of where things stood, and where things stood was somewhere penned between difficult and dangerous. The supply barn was gone. That was a cost she'd already calculated: materials, labor, time, and the feed stores they'd lost in the fire, which meant purchasing replacements at winter prices that were considerably worse than autumn prices. She'd written it all out in a new ledger page, with the calm precision of someone who understood that a problem on paper was a problem you could begin to solve. The cattle loss documentation had gone to the county sheriff in Cheyenne by the end of November, along with a cover letter she'd drafted and Ezra had signed. The letter named Bartholomew Pike. It named the specific pastures, the dates, the estimated values. It included the fence evidence, organized into a sequence that moved from observation to conclusion without a gap in the reasoning. She'd sent a copy to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, along with the water rights filing. And she'd sent one more copy, this one she hadn't told Ezra about until after, to a newspaper editor in Cheyenne she'd identified through 3 letters of inquiry as a man with a reputation for printing things that powerful people preferred unprinted. Ezra had read the letter to the editor when she put it in front of him. He'd been quiet for a moment. Then he'd said, "You sent this already?" "Yes," she said, without asking. "You were unconscious for most of Tuesday." He'd looked at the letter, at her. He'd picked up his coffee and said nothing else, which she had correctly interpreted as agreement. December arrived with the land surveyor. His name was Holt, a methodical man from Cheyenne who wore good boots and asked precise questions, and spent 2 days walking every boundary line of the Broken Elbow property with a theodolite and a notebook. He confirmed the spring. He filed the survey. He ate Corinne's biscuits at the table and said they were good, which they were by December. She'd made them enough times that they were reliable now, not just occasionally decent. Running Bear came on the second day of the survey, as he'd said he would, and stood at the spring while Holt documented it and gave a witness statement that he'd known the spring as part of Broken Elbow land for 11 years. He signed his name to the statement in English. He drank coffee in the cabin after and said nothing unnecessary, and left before noon. When Holt rode out with his completed survey, Corinne stood on the porch and watched him go, and felt something in her chest that was close to satisfaction, but had some iron in it, the particular feeling of a battle that had been won on paper, which was where the battles that lasted were always won first. She went inside and updated the water rights ledger. It was 2 days after the survey that the Aldrich family came. Martin Aldrich was a lean, sun-worn man in his late 40s who farmed the eastern boundary and had 3 sons who looked like slightly younger versions of him, each one quieter than the last. He came to the Broken Elbow on a grady December morning and stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and told Ezra that Pike had raised the price on the water access rights for his lower field. Not just raised, doubled. He's doing it to everyone, Martin said. His voice was flat and tired. The Foss brothers got a letter last week. Henderson, over on the North Range, got his cutoff entirely said there was a maintenance dispute on the access pipe. Henderson's got 40 head that need that water. Corinne was inside, but the window was cracked against the wood smoke, and she heard every word. She was already at the desk before Martin Aldrich had finished his second sentence. She pulled out the Foss brothers' contract. She pulled out the water rights ledger. She pulled out the original letter she'd received from the county clerk in September about jurisdictional water access law in Wyoming Territory, which she'd requested on a hunch and filed carefully. She brought the papers to the door. "Mr. Aldrich," she said. He looked at her. He was a man who'd grown up in a time and place where women didn't generally enter conversations between ranchers on front porches, and that history was visible briefly in his expression. Then he looked at the papers in her hands, and what she saw replace the initial hesitation was something more useful, a man who was tired enough and worried enough to accept help from wherever it came. "Ma'am," he said. She stepped out onto the porch. "Pike can raise his private access fees," she said. "That's legal. What he cannot legally do is cut off water access to established agricultural operations that have pre-existing riparian rights under territorial law." She held up the clerk's letter. "This is the relevant statute. Henderson's access to that water predates any agreement with Pike by at least 4 years, based on the land records. If Pike cut it off, he's in violation of territorial water law, not just in a contract dispute." Martin Aldrich looked at the letter. He looked at Ezra. "Is she right?" he said. "She's usually right," Ezra said. "About the law. About most things." Martin looked back at Corinne. "What do we do about it?" She told him. She told him clearly and specifically, the way she told everyone things, without performing confidence, just having it. Henderson needed to file a complaint with the county water commissioner immediately. The Foss brothers needed to not sign the revised contract Pike had apparently sent them. Everyone who'd received a document from Pike in the past 3 months needed to bring it to her. "She'll read it," Ezra said. "And," Martin said, "and she'll tell you what it actually says." Martin Aldrich nodded slowly. He put his hat back on. He looked out at the mountains, the particular look of a man who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been told he might be able to set it down. "I'll talk to Henderson," he said, "and the Foss boys. Soon," Corinne said, "before the end of the week." He went. The next 4 days brought 6 separate families to the Broken Elbow porch, each with documents, each with stories that were different in their details and identical in their structure. A man with resources and patience and lawyers, moving slowly across a valley of people who were working too hard and too tired to read the definition sections. She read every document. She found the problem in every one of them, because now she knew what she was looking for, and knowing what you're looking for is most of the work. On the 5th day, she sat at the desk in the evening and looked at what she'd assembled. 7 families, documented violations of territorial water law, a pattern of predatory contracts that, taken together, constituted something a territorial court could act on. The newspaper editor in Cheyenne had written back a short, interested letter asking for more. She wrote him more. She was still writing when Ezra came in from the barn and looked at the papers on the desk, and the lamp burning low, and her pen still moving. "Come to bed," he said. "One more letter. Corinne." She finished the sentence she was on. She put the pen down. She looked at the desk, the organized columns of damage, the neat architecture of everything Pike had done, laid out in the clear, unsparing light of documentation. "He's going to know," she said, "when the complaint is filed, when the paper prints it. He's going to know it was us." "He already knows," Ezra said. She picked up the pen again, then set it back down. "One more letter," she said. He looked at her. He went to bed. She wrote 3 more letters. The complaints were filed the 2nd week of December. The newspaper ran a piece the 3rd week. And Bartholomew Pike, who had spent 30 years building a position in the Wind River Valley on the assumption that the people he was building it over were too scattered and too tired to organize, discovered in the final days of December that he had made a miscalculation. He came with 12 men. It was a Sunday morning, clear and bitter, 15 degrees and dropping. The snow was hard crusted, and the sky was the specific pale blue of midwinter that had no warmth in it at all. Corinne was at the desk. Ezra was checking the cattle. Sergeant started barking. She was at the window in 3 seconds. She counted. 12 riders coming from the south, spread wide, moving with the loose, deliberate formation of men who've been given a job and are executing it. 2 of them were carrying something that caught the light. She identified it. A moment later, a chain and heavy iron bar. For the well, for the water, Pike rode in the center. He wasn't wearing his prosperous rancher coat today. He wore the coat of a man who'd stopped pretending, and it was a different garment entirely. She went to the door and called for Ezra, once, clearly. Then she went to the shelf and got the Winchester. She loaded it. She checked it. She stood at the open door and waited. Ezra came from the barn at a pace that was not running and was not casual. He read the situation in one look and positioned himself on the porch beside her. Then something happened that Pike had not planned for. From the east, through the cottonwoods along the creek, Martin Aldrich appeared on horseback, his 3 sons behind him. From the north, the 2 Foss brothers riding hard. From the south road, coming around Pike's flank, 3 more homesteaders, Henderson, and 2 others. And from the timber to the west, Running Bear and 4 of his men, moving at a quiet walk that was somehow more serious than any gallop. They positioned themselves in a rough arc around the yard. Not aggressive, not with weapons raised, just present, filling the spaces in the geography with the fact of themselves, which was its own kind of statement. Pike pulled his horse up in the middle of the yard. He looked at the arc of neighbors and Shoshone and the woman on the porch with the Winchester and the man beside her. Something moved across his face, a rapid calculation, a reassessment. He was good at recalculating. She'd known that from the first day she'd seen him. The smile that managed what it needed to manage. "He wasn't smiling now, Vance," he said. His voice was still controlled, still the voice of a man accustomed to rooms. "I'm here on legal business. Water access dispute, confirmed by the county. The county complaint is under review," Corinne said. "Filed December 9th, you received notice." He looked at her. The flat gray eyes made their assessment. Miss Leclerc, he said, your involvement in the affairs of this ranch is documented in a signed contract, she said, filed with the county clerk in September. I am the bookkeeper and correspondence manager of the Broken Elbow Ranch, with full authority to act on its behalf in record and legal matters. She held his gaze. You received a copy of that filing as well. He had. She'd made certain of it. One of his men moved his horse a step forward. Ezra's hand went to his belt without drama, without announcement, just went there. The man stopped. Pike looked at the arc of neighbors, at Running Bear's men. He looked at the Aldrich sons, who had not moved but were very clearly going to move if it became necessary. He looked at Henderson, whose water had been cut off and who had ridden through 15-degree cold to be present on a Sunday morning, which was a specific kind of statement about how a man felt about being wronged. Pike's mouth was a flat line. You've stirred up a great deal of trouble, he said. He said it to Ezra, but he was looking at Corinne. No, Ezra said. The trouble was already here. She just put it in writing. Pike looked at his 12 men, at the arc of neighbors, at the rifles that were present without being pointed. He was doing arithmetic, and the arithmetic was not coming out in his favor, and he knew it, and he was a man who understood when a room had turned. He got down from his horse. She hadn't expected that. She tightened her grip on the Winchester, and then made herself ease it, because a tight grip on a firearm, when a situation was tipping, was how accidents happened. Pike walked toward the porch. He stopped 10 feet out. He looked up at Ezra on the steps, then at Corinne beside him. He looked like what he was. In that moment, a man of 48 who had spent 30 years getting what he wanted and had just encountered, for possibly the first time in those 30 years, a wall that wasn't going to move because he pushed it. Name your terms, he said. It was not a request. It didn't quite sound like one, but it was. Ezra looked at him for a long moment. He came down off the porch steps onto the yard, one step at a time. He stood in the snow in front of Pike, and he was taller than Pike by 3 inches, and the morning light was behind him. The mob feeling in the yard had been building. She could feel it not from the homesteaders, who were angry but controlled, but from some of the others at the edges, men who'd ridden over from farther out, men who'd been squeezed by Pike's water prices for years, and who had grievances that predated hers by a decade. She could hear it in the quality of the silence, in the way certain horses were held in too tight. One of the men, she didn't know him, a young man from the North Range, called out from the edge of the yard. His voice was hot with it. String him up. We've got enough rope and plenty of reason. A few voices answered him. Not many, but enough to change the temperature of the yard. Ezra raised his right hand. Just raised it. The voices stopped. He lowered his rifle. He addressed the yard, not loudly, not performing it, just speaking clearly in his low, unhurried voice that didn't need to compete with anything, because it was the thing people listened to. If we use savagery to fight cruelty, we become the very monsters we fought. If this territory is ever going to thrive, it must be built on justice, the law, and humanity, not the wild rule of the gun. The yard was very quiet. The young man from the North Range opened his mouth. He looked at Ezra's face. He closed his mouth again. Martin Aldrich, from his horse in the east, made a sound that might have been assent, and might have been something older than that. The sound of a man who had been waiting to hear someone say that out loud, and had started to wonder if anyone would. Running Bear said nothing. He didn't need to. He simply was, at the edge of the yard in his buffalo robe, present and watching, and his presence was its own endorsement of what had just been said. Corinne stood on the porch with the Winchester in her hands and looked at Ezra in the yard, and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled since September. Not the situation was far from resolved, but something about what he'd just said, the plainness of it, the refusal to dress it up as anything other than what it was. A principle, stated in the cold to a yard full of armed and angry people with no certainty it would hold. It held. She looked at Pike. He was watching Ezra with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not the managed goodwill, not the controlled smile, not the flat calculation, just the face underneath all of it, which was the face of a man who'd built his life on other people's fear and had just seen a room full of afraid people choose something different. It wasn't a defeated face. He was too experienced for defeat to land cleanly in a single moment. But it was the face of a man who understood that the ground had shifted and was going to have to figure out where he stood on different ground. Water access is restored, Corinne said from the porch. To all established operations in the valley, at the pre-September pricing, effective immediately. The county commissioner's office will confirm in writing by the end of the week. She moved to the edge of the porch steps. The predatory contract clauses are void. The Foss brothers' agreement, and the others like it. Your lawyer will understand why when he reads the territorial statutes. She looked at Pike directly. The cattle losses will be compensated. The documentation is already with the county sheriff. You can let the process work, or you can contest it. But the records exist, and they're accurate, and a territorial court will see them. Pike looked at her for a long moment. You've been busy. Yes, she said. I have. Something moved across his face. It wasn't quite respect. It was more complicated than that, and she didn't want his respect anyway. It was recognition. The recognition of a man who understood that he'd been outworked on his own terrain, with his own tools by someone he'd dismissed. He looked at Ezra. Your bookkeeper, he said. It wasn't quite mockery, and it wasn't quite admiration. Something in between that didn't have a clean name. My partner, Ezra said. He said it simply. The way he said everything simple as a statement of fact. No decoration, no qualification. It hung in the cold air of the yard. Pike picked up his horse's reins. He looked once more at the arc of neighbors, at Running Bear, at the porch. He put his boot in the stirrup and mounted, and he turned his horse and rode out of the yard with his 12 men behind him. Not at a gallop, not in the way of retreat, but out. The yard held its silence for a moment after they'd gone. Then someone released a breath, one of the Foss brothers, she thought, and it seemed to give everyone permission to return to their own weight and their own cold and the particular reality of having held a line and watched it hold. Martin Aldrich rode to the edge of the porch. He looked at Corinne. He looked at Ezra. Is it over? He said. No, Ezra said. Martin nodded once. He'd expected that. But this part of it is, Corinne said. The next part is in the courts and in the commissioner's office, and it'll take time. But what happened today goes in the record. All of it. She looked at the families in the yard. I'll need statements from each of you, written, dated, specific, about the water access, the contracts, the price increases. Bring them to me this week, and I'll organize them into the county filing. The response was not what she'd expected. Not because they refused, they didn't, but the way they received it. The Foss brothers looked at each other and nodded. Henderson, the man whose water had been cut off, looked at her from his horse with an expression that had something of the same quality as Martin Aldrich's on the porch. That specific, tired relief of a person who has been given something practical to do about a thing that had seemed impossible to address. She was useful to them. She'd never had that before. Not in Philadelphia, not in any house or room she'd lived in. She'd been educated to be decorative and obedient and occasionally entertaining. She'd been useful to herself, which was something, and useful to Ezra, which was more. But this was different. This was a valley full of people who needed what she actually had. The ledgers, the letters, the definitions, sections, the knowledge of what law meant and what it didn't, and how to make paper say what needed to be said. Running Bear stopped his horse at the edge of the porch before he left. He looked at her. He looked at Ezra. The statement from today, he said to her, that we were here as witnesses. Yes, she said. I'd like that very much if you're willing. He was quiet for a moment. My grandfather's grandfather fished the spring you are protecting, he said. We do not forget water. He turned and rode into the timber, and his men went with him. and the yard emptied slowly until it was just Corinne on the porch and Ezra in the yard, and Sergeant investigating the tracks left by 12 strange horses, with enormous professional interest. The cold was serious, and the sun was already going, dropping fast behind the western peaks the way it did, in December one moment present, the next absent, no ceremony. The mountains caught the last of it on their snowfields and threw it back gold. Ezra walked to the porch. He stopped at the bottom step and looked up at her. She was still holding the Winchester. She looked down at it, somewhat surprised to find it in her hands. Still, the situation had resolved, and she'd simply been holding it through the aftermath without noticing. She set it against the porch rail. "Partner," she said. He looked at her. "You said partner," she said. "I did." She was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable, just absorbing it. "The trial contract ends in 10 days, she said. 1st of January, I know. We should discuss renewal terms." He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. "We should." He came up the porch steps. He went to the door and held it. She went inside, and he followed, and the door closed on the cold and the yard, and the fading gold of the peaks. The stove was banked from the morning. She built it back up the damper, the draft, the tinder catching on the first strike now, every time, without fail. She filled the coffee pot. She moved through the cabin with the ease of a person in a place that belongs to her, which it did, because she had a contract that said so, and because she had made biscuits in this kitchen more times than she could count, and knew where every tool was, and why. Ezra sat at the table. He had his forearms on the wood, and he was looking at the fire, and the late light from the window was behind him, and he looked not tired, exactly. Not the tired of a man who'd failed. The tired of a man who'd been carrying something for a long time, and had just set some of it down. She put the coffee in front of him and sat across from him. "He'll be in court by February," she said. "The water access case alone will take months. The cattle loss claim will take longer. I know. We'll need to be there. Multiple times. Cheyenne, probably. I know that, too." She wrapped her hands around her cup. Outside, the wind was starting its evening work, pushing down from the mountains, testing the walls the way it always tested them, and finding them solid the way they always were. "The supply barn needs to be rebuilt," she said. "I've already priced the materials. If we order the lumber this week from the Lander mill, we can have it here before the worst of January." Martin Aldrich's boys offered to help with the labor. Ezra looked at her. "I told him we'd decide," she said. "Tell him yes," he said. She nodded. She'd already drafted the letter. She would send it tomorrow. They sat with their coffee in the quiet cabin, and the fire built itself to a proper burn, and the light went the particular gold amber of a winter evening, and then went to dark, and outside the valley settled into its night, enormous and cold and completely indifferent, and somehow, for all of that, home. She thought about the yard full of people, about Running Bear's grandfather's grandfather, and the spring, about Martin Aldrich's tired, relieved face, about a young man from the North Range who had wanted rope and a reason and had listened instead. She thought about what Ezra had said in the cold to a yard full of people who needed to hear it. If this territory is ever going to thrive, it must be built on justice, the law, and humanity, not the wild rule of the gun. She thought about that, about what it meant to build something instead of just defending it, about the difference between holding a line and laying a foundation. She'd come to Wyoming with a small valise and a ruined silk dress and a set of skills that didn't match the job description, and a desperation she'd turned into something else, somewhere between the Nebraska border and a cliffside cave in a blizzard. She'd signed a 3-month contract that was ending in 10 days. She looked at the fire. She looked at the man across the table. She picked up her coffee. "January, terms," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'll draft something." "All right." She'd already started it in her head. Not the wages. Those were a detail. The thing she was composing in the back of her mind was larger than that, though she wouldn't put all of it on paper. Some things didn't go in ledgers. Some things you wrote in a different way, with a different instrument, over a longer period of time. Outside, the creek ran under its ice, north and steady. The fire breathed. The mountains held their dark at the edges. She pulled the ledger toward her and turned to a fresh page. At the top, in her clean architectural hand, she wrote, January. And she began. Spring came the way it always came to the Wind River Valley, not gently, not gradually, but in argument with winter. March brought mud that swallowed fence posts to the knee, and a sequence of warm days and hard freezes that couldn't seem to agree on anything. The creek ran high and loud with snowmelt. The cattle, released from the lower barn at last, moved through the pastures with the stunned, blinking energy of creatures returning to a world they'd half forgotten. Corinne noticed all of it. She noticed the way the light changed longer now, staying past 6 in the evening, painting the western peaks in colors that September had never offered. She noticed the first green pushing up through the frost-pale grass in the south pasture. She noticed the mud on every boot, on every floor, tracked in and tracked out, the endless negotiation between a working ranch and the season that was trying to rebuild it. She also noticed Ezra. He was rebuilding the supply barn. He'd started in February with the Aldrich boys' help, framing it up in the cold, and now with March here, he was working on it in longer stretches early morning until the light gave out, sometimes longer. She brought food out to him. He ate it standing up, looking at the structure, already thinking about the next thing. His shoulder had healed. The bullet wound had healed. His body had come back from November with the stubborn competence of a man who hadn't given it much choice. But something else wasn't healed. She'd known it since the relay station, since the ride home in the pre-dawn dark. She knew it, the way she knew the ledgers, not from one number, but from the pattern the numbers made together. He slept badly. She heard it through the wall not every night, but often enough. A restlessness that didn't have words attached to it from her side, only sound. The creak of the bed frame. Boots on the floor at 3 in the morning. Silence after that, and then the soft sound of the door to the outside, and then nothing for an hour. She didn't ask. She'd learned that there were things Ezra carried the way. He carried physical weight steadily, without complaint, with the assumption that it was simply his to carry, and no one else's business. She knew that assumption was wrong. She just hadn't found the right moment yet. The moment found her. It was a Thursday in late March, warm enough to work with the barn doors open. The smell of new pine lumber cutting through the mud, and the cold that still lived in the shadows. Corinne was at the desk finishing the spring supply orders when she heard a sound she didn't immediately categorize, coming from the barn. A kind of rough, compressed sound, like something held in that had decided to stop being held. She got up. She crossed the yard in the mud and came to the open barn door and looked in. Ezra was in the far corner, on the ground with his back against the wall. He had his knees pulled up and his forearms across them and his head down. He was shaking, not dramatically, not the way she'd been shaking in the cave when her shoulder was done. Smaller than that, and somehow worse. The fine, continuous trembling of a man whose body was doing something his mind hadn't authorized. Sargent was beside him. The dog had pressed his whole body against Ezra's left side and was just there, solid and warm, and not asking anything from the situation except to be part of it. Corinne came in. She crossed the barn floor without hurrying. She didn't call out to him, didn't announce herself. She came and sat down in the straw beside him, on his right side, close enough that their shoulders touched. She pulled her knees up the same way. She didn't say anything. He didn't look up. The barn held its quiet around them. Outside, a meadowlark was doing something optimistic in the fence posts. The creek talked to itself in the distance. After a while, his breathing changed. Slower. Something coming down from wherever it had been. I was in a field in Virginia, he said. He didn't look up when he said it. His voice was low and uninflected, the voice he used when he was stating facts. 1,863. There was a farm family, 2 boys and their mother. I'd been sent ahead to assess the position, and I found the farmhouse occupied Confederate pickets, 6 of them, using it as a forward post. He stopped. Sergeant leaned heavier against him. My orders were specific, he said. The position had to be cleared before the main advance. He went quiet again. She sat with it. They made it out, he said. The family. I got them out first. That part I managed. A pause, the boys. They were maybe 8 and 10. They kept looking back at the house while I was moving them. Like if they looked long enough, it would still be there when they turned around again. He finally looked up. His eyes were red at the edges, which she'd never seen before, and his face had the particular stripped quality she recognized from her own mirror in September, the face of someone who'd put down every piece of armor for a moment and was sitting with what was underneath. It wasn't there, he said. When they turned around again, she put her arm around him. Not tentatively. She put her arm around him the way she'd learned to do everything out here, fully committed, without hedging. She felt him go still for a second, and then, gradually, not still. His head came down against hers, and they sat in the straw in the spring barn, with Sergeant pressed between them and the meadowlark going on outside. And she held him while something in him let go of a grip it had kept for 11 years. She wasn't trying to fix it. She'd learned enough by now to understand that some things didn't get fixed. They got carried differently, redistributed, shared out so no single person was bent double under the weight. That was what she had to offer. Not a solution. Herself. He didn't cry. He sat and breathed and let her hold on, and after a while the shaking stopped and his breathing was steady, and they just sat there in the quiet. You got them out, she said. The boys. Yes. That's what happened. First, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about that lately, trying to make that be the thing I remember first. He looked at the barn floor. Some days it works. Keep practicing, she said. You'll get better at it. She paused. You taught me that. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that direction. Did I? Every single morning for 6 months, she said. You're better at it than you think. He sat up slightly. He looked at her. There was something in the way he looked at her in that moment that she felt across her whole body. Not romantic, exactly too large for that word, too old and too specific. The look of a person seeing you completely and finding what they see something they want to keep seeing. She'd never been looked at that way before in her life. She'd been assessed, managed, evaluated, judiced, never just seen. She looked back. She didn't look away. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday morning when the mud had finally begun to firm and the high pasture was showing real color, Ezra came into the cabin before breakfast and put something on the table in front of her. A document. She looked at it. He'd had it drawn up by the county clerk in March. She recognized the official stamp, a deed. The Broken Elbow Ranch, Wyoming Territory. 2 names on it in the formal print of official documents. Ezra James Vance, Corinne Marie Leclerc, 50% each. She looked at the document for a long time. Long enough that the coffee on the stove got past ready and started minding its own business. She looked up at him. He was standing at the table with his hands in his pockets, watching her with his steady gray eyes, not performing anything. Just there. The trial contract ended in January, he said. I'm aware. I should have done this in January. He paused. I was working up to it. She looked at the deed. Her name, printed in official ink, attached to something real, something that couldn't be revoked because a more powerful person changed the terms. Something with her name on it that was genuinely, legally, irrevocably hers. She'd kept the coins in the pouch, inside the trunk, taken them out sometimes, not to count them, just to feel what they meant. This was heavier than coins. I'll sign it, she said after breakfast. All right, he said. She got up and dealt with the coffee. She made the biscuits properly, reliably, without thinking about it now the way she used to think about breathing. She put food on the table, and they sat down and ate. And outside the valley was coming back green from under the snow. And the creek was loud with its spring business, and the morning light came in flat and gold through the south window. She signed the deed after breakfast, her name in her clear architectural hand, next to his. She put it on the shelf where the trial contract had lived, where she could see it from the desk. That evening, Ezra came in from the last of the barn work and washed up and sat down at the table. And she was already there, with the ledger open and the lamp lit. He sat across from her and looked at the shelf, at the deed, and then at her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She turned the ledger page. Outside, the meadowlark was still at it, indefatigable, informing the fence posts of its opinions in the long spring evening. Sargent groaned contentedly in front of the fire. She wrote at the top of the new page, Spring 1875. And she kept going. The wedding was in May, on a Saturday, in the yard between the cabin and the rebuilt barn. Corinne had not expected it to feel like anything particularly significant, which was its own kind of evidence for how wrong she could be. She'd been to enough Philadelphia weddings, elaborate, performative, expensive ceremonies that were less about the two people at the center than about the statement those people's families wished to make to every other family in the room. She'd come to think of weddings as a form of public ledger entry, a declaration of assets combined. This was not that. There were maybe 20 people. The Aldrich family, the Foss brothers, Henderson and his wife, 2 other homesteads from the valley, and Running Bear with 3 of his people, who stood at the edge of the gathering with the particular dignity of guests who are choosing to be present rather than obligated to be. The county judge had ridden out from Willow Creek, a small, precise man named Dobbins, who took his office seriously and read the vows from a worn book he'd clearly read many times before. Corinne wore the blue-green silk dress. She'd spent 2 evenings in April, carefully repairing it, the hem, the sleeve, the creases that hadn't ever entirely pressed out. It wasn't what it had been in Philadelphia. It was something else now. It had Wyoming in it. It had the Nebraska border, and a cave, and a blizzard, and a frozen riverbank, and 7 months of actual life embedded in every place it had been mended. She thought that made it better. Ezra wore his dark coat and a clean white shirt and had shaved, which was notable enough that Martin Aldrich's youngest son remarked on it with the candor of a 12-year-old. Ezra's expression when he saw her cross the yard toward him was something she filed carefully and planned to think about for the rest of her life. Judge Dobbins read the vows. They were the traditional ones, the old, serious words that had been said in 100,000 different places and still meant something because of what they asked, rather than what they promised. Ezra said them plainly, the way he said everything plain, looking at her the whole time. She said them back. When it was over, it was over. There was no elaborate ceremony following. Mary Aldrich had brought a cake, a real one, with dried fruit in it, dense and good, and someone had produced a fiddle, and the afternoon went the way good afternoons went when people who had been through hard things together gathered to mark something important. Running Bear, before he left, shook Ezra's hand and looked at Corinne. "The valley is better," he said. Not a compliment exactly, a statement of observed fact, in the way she'd come to appreciate. "We're working on it," she said. He nodded once and took his people and rode south into the timber, quiet as always. Later, after everyone had gone and the evening was coming on and the yard was empty again except for Sargent patrolling the perimeter, with enormous seriousness, they went inside. The cabin was warm. She'd banked the stove that morning, and it had held all day. The lamp was burning on the shelf. The deed was still there, both their names on it, the ink long since dried into permanence. She stood in the middle of the cabin and looked at it. He came in behind her and closed the door, and the evening closed around the cabin the way it always did that specific settling of the valley into its own quiet, the mountains going dark against a sky still holding some color in the west. She turned around. He was standing 2 feet away, looking at her with the expression she'd filed in the barn in March and had continued thinking about since. Still the same expression. More of it. Maybe. More present. Corinne, he said. Just her name. The way he'd said it. In the cave, in the blizzard, holding her shoulder while she grabbed his coat and told him it hurt too much. The same voice. Low. Steady completely. There, I know, she said. He raised one hand and touched her face. Just that his rough, calloused hand against her jaw. Careful, like he was handling something that mattered. She turned her face into it. What came after was slow. He was always deliberate, and this was no different, each thing considered. Nothing rushed. The same patience he brought to every difficult thing. He'd spent 11 years learning that his strength could damage, that the world he moved through was full of things that broke. She watched him be careful with her and felt the carefulness as something entirely different from fragility. He wasn't careful because she was breakable. He was careful because she mattered. She told him that. She said it against his shoulder while his arms were around her, and the lamplight was doing something warm to everything in the room. He went very still for a moment. Say that again, he said. She said it again. His arms tightened. Not too much, just enough to feel real. They moved together through the cabin in the lamplight, and she was not afraid. That was the thing she noticed, most clearly how completely the fear was absent. She'd spent years in Philadelphia, being managed by fear in one form or another. Fear of the wrong expression, or the wrong word, or the wrong man's displeasure, and she'd assumed some residue of that would follow her everywhere. It hadn't followed her here. He was kissing the scar on her wrist, the left one, from the chains in November when she felt it. The newness of everything, the overwhelming accumulation of sensation, his size and his warmth, and the weight of what they were to each other, pressing in all at once. She caught her breath. Her fingers found his shoulders and held. It hurts too much, she whispered. He stopped, immediately, completely. He raised his head and looked at her, all the way into her, the way he looked at things that required his full attention. That's why I'm here, he said, against her ear, quiet and absolute. The words moved through her like the fire moved through the cook stove when she said it right from a small thing to a real and steady thing, filling the whole space. Not a promise of comfort, something larger. I am here, for this and for whatever comes after, and for all of it. The fear went out of the room. What replaced it was something she didn't have a word for and didn't need one. It was the feeling of arriving somewhere after a very long journey, not the exhaustion of arrival, but the specific profound relief of it. The moment when you stop moving because you are at last in the right place. She had been traveling since September. She had come through Wyoming in a ruined silk dress and gone over the edge of a mountain on a frightened horse, and had her shoulder set in a cave and read definitions sections, and held a Winchester on a porch in 15-degree cold. She had been dragged away in chains and sat in a locked room in a relay station, and kept breathing. 4 counts in and 4 counts out, because that was what you did. She had arrived. He held her through the night. The fire breathed slow in the stove. Sergeant, outside in his spot on the porch, sighed once with enormous satisfaction and was quiet. She woke before dawn when the window showed only the beginning of lighter dark rather than actual light. He was asleep. She lay still and listened to him, breathed and looked at the same ceiling she'd looked at in September on her first morning, small and honest, and exactly what it was, and felt the specific iron-solid happiness of a person who knows where they are. She slept again. She dreamed of numbers in columns, perfectly balanced, the way they were when everything had been properly accounted for. The meadowlark got her at 6. She got up and dressed and went to the stove and had the coffee going before she heard his boots on the floor in the other room.
Err. He came out. He looked at her in the gray spring morning.
She poured the coffee and set it on the table and sat down across from him, and the valley came alive outside with its usual indifference to human events, and everything was exactly what it was. Good enough, more than good enough. June brought the schoolhouse. It was Corinne's doing, start to finish. She'd been thinking about it since December, since Running Bear had said, "We do not forget water," and she'd understood that what she had to offer the valley went past ledgers and definition sections. She'd been putting it in the back of her mind the way you put things that matter, but aren't yet ready. And in March, when the deed had two names on it and the supply barn was standing again, she'd brought it forward. She wrote the proposal herself: funding, materials, curriculum, timeline. She took it to the county school board in Cheyenne in April, in writing, with a covering letter that left no room for vague objections. She got approval in 6 weeks, which she'd been told was faster than usual. Martin Aldrich's boys built it. They put it on the eastern edge of the Broken Elbow property, in the meadow where the light was good most of the day, a single-room structure, tight and practical, with 6 rows of benches and a proper blackboard she'd ordered from Cheyenne and a wood stove in the corner that she knew exactly how to operate. She put books on the shelf along the south wall, her own, brought from Philadelphia in the valise that had survived everything. More she ordered through the Cheyenne contact. Montaigne was there. A copy Ezra had found her at the Willow Creek Mercantile in February, left on a back shelf by someone who'd passed through, its spine cracked and its pages soft. She'd taken it as a good sign. School opened on a Monday in June with 11 children. 7 were the children of Valley homesteaders, the Aldriches, the Foss nephews who'd been sent out from back east, Henderson's 2 daughters, a girl named Ruth from the North Range, who rode 4 miles each way on a patient old gray horse. 4 were Shoshone children, sent by Running Bear's extended family, who arrived together each morning with the particular self-contained dignity of people who had decided that what this woman was offering was worth their time and would not be wasted. Corinne taught them all the same things. Reading, first, because reading was the first tool. Mathematics, because numbers told you the truth when people didn't. Geography, where they were in the world and what the world contained. History, because a person who didn't know where they'd come from couldn't find their footing in where they were going. She taught them what was fair, not as an abstract principle, but practically in the daily negotiation of 11 children from different places learning to share the same room. She didn't lecture about it. She just arranged the room so that fairness was the path of least resistance and let them work out the rest. The Shoshone girl, named Bright Morning, learned to read in 3 weeks. She read everything Corinne put in front of her and came back the next day wanting more. And Corinne found herself staying up past midnight to have enough material ready. She wrote to Cheyenne for more books. She wrote to a women's college in the East that she'd heard of, explaining what she was doing and asking for their surplus reading materials. And 2 months later, a crate arrived at the Willow Creek Depot that made Garfield, the storekeeper, look at the label twice and then at Corinne with a new expression. "Book learning for Indian children," he said. Not approvingly, not disapprovingly. "Processing in every other child in the valley," she said. "You have 2 grandchildren, I believe. They're welcome." Both grandchildren appeared at the schoolhouse the following Monday. The county water case moved through the territorial court in Cheyenne over the summer. Corinne was there for 3 of the 5 hearings, she and Ezra riding together to Cheyenne on the train from the new station at Lander, which was not comfortable but was considerably faster than the buckboard. She sat at the table beside Ezra and the valley's lawyer, and she knew the documentation better than anyone in the room because she had written most of it. And when the judge asked questions about the specific records, she answered them. Pike's lawyer was a good one. She gave him that. He found 3 places where the documentation could have been stronger, and she filed responses to each of them before he'd finished making the arguments, which the judge noticed. By September, the water access ruling came down. Full restoration of pre-existing riparian rights for all established operations in the valley. fines levied against Pike's company for the November cutoff and the predatory contract clauses. The cattle loss settlement followed in October. Not everything, but enough. Enough to rebuild the supply barn properly, to extend the south fence, to buy seed stock for spring. Pike himself had largely gone quiet. He was still in Willow Creek, still owned the controlling interest in 3 businesses, still moved through town like a man accustomed to being noticed. But he moved more carefully now. The flat gray eyes had picked up something not fear, exactly. More like the attentiveness of a man who has learned that a room contains things he hadn't previously thought to look for. He'd never apologized. She hadn't expected him to. What she had expected, and gotten, was for it to be in the record. All of it properly documented, dated, signed. A paper history of what had happened in the Wind River Valley in 1874 and 1875, written in the kind of language that courts read and clerks filed and time didn't easily erase. She'd written the definitive account of a man like Pike, and she'd written it in ink, on official paper, and filed it in the one place he couldn't reach it. That was enough. On a Saturday morning in October, exactly 1 year after the day, she'd stood on a depot platform and burst into tears at the sight of the mountains. Corinne was at the south fence with the mending kit, reattaching a section of wire that a curious heifer had taken an opinion about. Her hands were competent on the pliers now. No hesitation. The barb nicked her through the glove, and she put her finger in her mouth and kept going, because that was simply what you did. She heard boots on the ground behind her. She turned. Ezra was coming across the pasture with something in his arms. As he got closer, she understood what it was. He was carrying their son, born in late August, who was currently regarding the approaching fence line with the solemn, comprehensive attention of a person seeing the world for the first time and finding it extremely interesting. The baby's name was Theodore, which she'd chosen for her grandfather, and which Ezra had said once, carefully, and then practiced until it was smooth in his mouth, and said it regularly from then on without difficulty. Theo, they called him. He had Ezra's gray eyes and her dark hair, and a set of opinions about the world that were already making themselves clear at 2 months old. Ezra stopped at the fence and held the baby out so he could see over it, into the south pasture where the cattle were doing their September business. Theo regarded the nearest heifer with enormous seriousness. "She approved your fence repair," Ezra said. "She caused the problem in the first place. That's often how it goes." He looked at what she'd done with the wire. "Good mend. Thank you." The morning was cold but clear. The particular October clarity that she had come to associate with this valley, the air so clean and sharp it made you want to fill your lungs twice. The peaks to the north had their first snow. Not much. A dusting on the highest points, a reminder that what was coming, and that they would be ready. She was ready. She was always ready now. She'd been keeping the larder stocked since September, ordering in bulk, the Lander Mill arrangement running smoothly in its 3rd year. The wood was stacked under the overhang 3 months' worth, heading toward 4. The root cellar was organized with the obsessive precision of someone who had learned in the winter of 1874 exactly what being unprepared for cold meant. Ezra handed Theo to her. She took him in her left arm, the shoulder that had been dislocated in a cave in October of last year, and had healed completely, leaving only a faint ache in cold weather that she'd come to think of as useful information rather than inconvenience. The baby turned his gray eyes to her face. She looked back at him. She thought about that question he'd asked her once, riding across the sage flats after Willow Creek. Room for what? Room to be a different size. She'd thought she was talking about herself. She understood now. She'd also been talking about something she hadn't had words for yet. A life that was the actual size it needed to be, not trimmed and managed and constrained into the shape someone else had decided was appropriate. This size. This specific, large, cold, demanding, extraordinary size. Ezra was leaning on the fence post watching her and the baby. He had the expression she'd first noticed in the barn in March and had been keeping track of since. It hadn't changed. It had just become familiar, the way everything here had become familiar, the creek's voice, the morning routine, the feel of the fencing pliers in her hands. "The schoolhouse is going well," she said. "I know." Bright Morning found her own copy of Montaigne somewhere. "Brought it in to show you." "I know." I lent it to her. She looked at the mountains. "She wants to write a letter to a school back east for books." She paused. I told her I'd help her draft it. "She'll do fine with it," Ezra said. "She's read everything you've put in front of her." "I know." Corinne looked at Theo, who had decided the fence post was the most interesting thing he'd seen today and was committed to staring at it. "I want to expand the curriculum next year. History more formally, some natural science. There's so much to work with right here. The land itself is the best classroom." "Write up the proposal," Ezra said. "I'll look at it." She turned to look at him. He was serious, not humoring her, genuinely interested in the proposal, in the same way he was genuinely interested in the spring survey and the supply ledgers and the fence line, because it was a real thing happening on real land that they were building together. And it mattered. She handed Theo back to him. The baby accepted the transfer with philosophical equanimity. She picked up the fencing pliers and went back to work on the wire. Above them, the hawks rode the thermals over the valley, moving on the warm air that still came up from the sage flats, even in October. Below, the creek ran north, steady and purposeful, the same creek that had run cold and black under its ice last November, while she sat in a wagon in chains telling herself to breathe. The same water, going the same direction it had always gone. She twisted the wire into place. She stepped back. She checked it. Solid. She looked out across the south pasture. The cattle moved through the fall grass, unhurried, doing their uncomplicated work. The mountains beyond them were enormous and indifferent and completely themselves, the way they always were, and the sky above the mountains was the particular blue of October that she had come to love in a way she hadn't loved anything about landscape before she came here. Ezra came to stand beside her at the fence. Theo was in the crook of his arm, studying the horizon with the gray-eyed seriousness that he'd apparently inherited, along with the eye color. The three of them stood at the south fence in the October morning and looked at the valley. All of it, enormous and real and present, belonging to no one and to everyone who was willing to learn what it asked of them. She'd come here with a small valise and a ruined dress and a desperation she'd turned into something else. She'd signed a 3-month contract. She'd burned her hand on a skillet and read definition sections and held a Winchester on a porch in 15-degree cold and learned to make biscuits and set a fence post and build a fire on the first try, every time, without fail. She'd written it all down, every bit of it, dated and signed, in the clean architectural hand that didn't lie. She'd arrived. Ezra looked over at her. She looked back at him. Theo, between them, made a sound of complete personal satisfaction and grabbed a fistful of Ezra's coat, which was exactly the correct thing to do. The morning went on doing what mornings did. The fence held. The cattle moved through the grass. The creek talked to itself in the distance, heading north the way it had always headed, steady and purposeful, and entirely itself. She picked up the mending kit. She turned toward the cabin. Ezra fell into step beside her. The ranch came into view as they came around the corral, the cabin, the rebuilt barn, the smoke going straight up from the chimney in the still morning air. The schoolhouse in the meadow to the east, its windows catching the light. She looked at the smoke. She felt the pull of it, the specific warm weight of a place calling you back, the same pull she'd felt for the first time coming home through the snow after the blizzard. Before she'd known what to call it. She knew what to call it now. Home was not a place you were born into. It was a place you chose, and kept choosing, day after day, in the small patient work of building something that lasted. It was the fire you learned to start correctly, and the fence you mended, and the ledger you kept, and the child in the crook of his father's arm, blinking at the mountains, like they were the most obvious miracle in the world. It was the contract you signed with your eyes open, the terms you negotiated for yourself, the name you wrote in your own hand on a deed that was genuinely yours. She walked toward it. She did not look back. The Wind River Valley lay enormous and clear in the October light, holding everything it had always held, and more now, more than it had held last year, a little more than it would hold tomorrow. She went in and built the fire and put the coffee on, and the morning did what mornings do when everything is working the way it should. The valley thrived. There's a moment near the end of this story that I keep coming back to. Corinne is standing at the south fence in October, mending wire with her own hands, the same hands that couldn't crack an egg without getting shell in the pan 9 months earlier. She doesn't think about Philadelphia. She doesn't think about the man who tried to chain her to a life she never chose. She just twists the wire into place, steps back, checks it, and thinks, solid. That single word solid is the whole story, because that's what this story is really about. Not the frontier. Not the romance, though there's plenty of it, earned slowly and honestly, in the way the best things are always earned. It's about what happens when a person stops performing the life they were assigned and starts building the one they actually want. Corinne LeClaire arrives in Wyoming with nothing but a ruined dress, a small valise, and a desperation she's smart enough to turn into direction. She doesn't know how to cook. She doesn't know how to ride. She's never lit a cook fire in her life. And none of that stops her because competence isn't what you start with. It's what you build. One burned hand, and one mended fence, and one definition section at a time. What this story gives you, if you let it, is a quietly radical idea that the terms of your life are negotiable. Corinne reads every contract before she signs it. She asks for her wages weekly instead of monthly, not because the math is different, but because weekly feels like a wage and monthly feels like an allowance, and she knows the difference matters. She puts her name on a deed. She files the documentation. She writes it all down, dated and signed, in the kind of language that courts read and time doesn't easily erase. She understands something that most people spend their whole lives learning. The best protection against being rewritten is having already written it down yourself. And Ezra, quiet, weathered, carrying 11 years of a war he never put down, teaches us something different but equally necessary. He teaches us that strength and care are not opposites, that a man can reset a dislocated shoulder in a blizzard and still wrap it gently afterward, that you can stand in front of a grizzly bear without calculating it and keep watch all night in a cave without needing anyone to notice. He teaches us that some things you do simply because they are the next right thing, and that's enough of a reason. He stands in a yard full of angry armed men and says plainly, without theater, if this territory is ever going to thrive, it must be built on justice, the law, and humanity, not the wild rule of the gun. And the yard goes quiet, not because he's the biggest man there, because he's the most honest one. Together, they build something. Not just a ranch, not just a legal case against a man who thought he could own a valley. They build a life that belongs to both of them equally, on paper and in practice. They build a schoolhouse. They teach a girl named Bright Morning to read, and she reads everything. And that changes what's possible for everyone around her. They show up for their neighbors. They file the paperwork. They do the unglamorous, patient, necessary work of making something last. That's the gift this story offers. Not escape, not fantasy. Something harder and better than both of those things, the reminder that a life can be rebuilt from the middle of it. That arriving somewhere new, terrified and underprepared, is not a failure. It's a starting point. That learning to build a fire, really learning it, until you do it right on the first try every time that matters. That the small, repeated, honest work of competence is the same thing, at its core, as the large and lasting work of dignity. Corinne came to Wyoming with a contract for 3 months. She stayed because she chose to, and that's the whole point. She chose it, with open eyes, full information, and her name signed in her own hand on terms she had negotiated for herself. That's not a small thing. In 1874 now, that's not a small thing at all. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and locations are invented for narrative purposes and do not represent real historical persons or actual events. The legal and historical details have been adapted for dramatic storytelling and should not be taken as factual reference.